Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm David Gura alongside Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, March the 7th. President Trump awake and posting on this weekend morning new warnings about Iran. Here's the latest.
Fresh strikes underway against Iran, and Iran hits back. President Trump making a new demand, unconditional surrender.
In Iran, we're doing very well. Somebody said, how would you score it from 0 to 10? I said, I'd give it a 12 to a 15.
But this morning, Iran's president says his country will never surrender as the White House pushes back on questions about U.S. munitions.
We have more than enough ammunitions, weapons, stockpiles to achieve the objectives of Operation Epic Fury and beyond.
Americans bracing for a big jump in oil and gas prices, up 9 cents overnight.
The price at the pump matters a lot in terms of sentiment, in terms of crowding out other spending. And so I'm just watching prices at the pump.
As the war opens up new fronts, new uncertainties, and new hardships for people on the ground.
Happy to welcome you across Bloomberg's many platforms. Those of you watching on Bloomberg Television, listening on Bloomberg Radio, streaming the show on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app.
We're going to be here every Saturday and Sunday from 7 to 10 a.m. Wall Street time. We've got breaking news, we've got headlines, we've got analysts from around the world. And of course, we will keep you up to date on those business headlines as they happen over the weekend. But the story everyone is talking about yet again this weekend is Iran. As you mentioned, the president up and at 'em live early this morning, taking a Truth Social.
That breaking news that you mentioned, and we're going to read from the president's Truth Social post. I'll handle the history at the top. You can get into what he's saying about what's likely to happen over the course of the day. The president writes, Iran, which is being beat to hell, has apologized and surrendered to its Middle East neighbors and promised that it will not shoot at them anymore. This promise was only made because of the relentless U.S. and Israeli attack. They were looking to take over and rule the Middle East. It is the first time that Iran has ever lost in thousands of years to surrounding Middle Eastern countries. They have said, thank you, President Trump. I have said, you're welcome. Iran is no longer the bully of the Middle East. They are instead the loser of the Middle East and will be for many decades until they surrender or, more likely, completely collapse.
And then the new news in there is the president goes on to say today Iran will be hit very hard under serious consideration for complete destruction and certain death. Because of Iran's bad behavior, are areas and groups of people that were not considered for targeting up until this moment in time. Thank you for your attention to this matter, ! Signed, President Donald J. Trump. All right, now we want to go to Lisa Mateo with the headlines, and we will come back to talk more about that latest from the president. Lisa, what you got?
And all of this coming in as the war in Iran enters its second week. Now, ahead of the president's warning, we had Israel launching another wave of strikes on Tehran. Iran targeted missiles at Israel. Saudi Arabia stepped up direct engagement with Iran to try and prevent this conflict from worsening. The Saudi press agency said the country has intercepted drones heading toward an oil field. Saudi Arabia also intercepted 2 ballistic missiles launched toward Prince Sultan Air Base and drones east of Riyadh. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. believes that Russia has been providing Iran with the locations of American troops in the region, including aircraft and ships. We have White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. She said it wasn't an issue because the U.S. was still winning the war.
But of course, as the president has maintained, we have more than enough ammunitions, weapons, stockpiles to achieve the objectives of Operation Epic Fury and beyond. We've taken out nearly 30 of their ships. Their Navy has been deemed combat ineffective. 90% reduction in ballistic missile retaliatory strikes against the United States and our Gulf Arab and partners in the region. So, of course, we are achieving the military objectives of this operation.
Washington also pushing back on worries around surging energy costs as U.S. prices at the pump rose Friday to the highest in September of 2024. Now, Brent crude had settled at over $92 a barrel. Oil traders, they're warning that prices could reach $100 within days, with shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz all but halted. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tells Fox that the U.S. could further ease sanctions on Russian oil to increase supply. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett explained the plan to Bloomberg.
The sanction waiver that Secretary Bessent came out with is just one of many, many tools that we have ready. We've got a whole flow chart of tools to use depending on this or that, and we're ready to move them as soon as we have to. But we're also very optimistic that we're going to be able to get this near-term problem resolved relatively quickly.
The military campaign also roiled equity and bond markets worldwide. Now, Dubai's Emirates, it plans to resume operation, and that's after flights were temporarily suspended following disruption caused by another round of interceptions. Now, Dubai International Airport also temporarily suspended operations. Retaliatory strikes from Iran, it led the UAE to shut down its airspace, caused minor structural damage to the hub in Dubai. Airlines in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, David and Christina, they have also had their operations halted.
Lisa, thank you very much. Lisa Mateo setting us up here for this conversation, our first about Iran on this Saturday morning. And we've got a great group of guests here to join us to walk us through all of it. We got Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, joining us from Washington, D.C. Elise, Labott, the founder of Zivi Media, joining us as well. And Dan Williams from Jerusalem, one of our reporters there in Israel. Jeff, let me start with you. I read the Truth Social post at the top. A little bit of context here. We heard from the president of Iran earlier today, effectively saying to Gulf leaders that Iran was no longer going to attack them, provided they did not lob missiles at Iran. Help us understand what the president is saying in this rather long Truth Social post about what's likely to change over the course of the day. And I should note, an incredibly busy day for the president with travel to Florida, now heading to Delaware for a dignified transfer as well. What can we expect from the White House, from the president today?
That's right. And just briefly to explain what a dignified transfer is, he'll be going to Delaware to basically be present for the return of the remains of some or all, we're not sure yet, of the troops who were killed overseas as a result of the retaliation by Iran. The president had warned in his video almost exactly a week ago today that there was a possibility that U.S. troops, that there would be U.S. casualties, and that has happened. There are 6, and he is going there today to pay his respects. But broadly, David, to the post that you referenced that just came out this morning, it's an escalation, and it's in line with what President Trump has been saying all week. Number one, that he believes that so far the U.S. and Israeli operation has been extremely successful. He also called on Iran to surrender, and they are rejecting that call. And so he is upping the ante and saying that more attacks are going to come, and saying that more areas and more groups of people are going to be targeted. And that is how I think we're learning right now President Trump runs a war.
Dan Williams, I want to go to you because you and Jeff Mason have a joint byline out kind of summarizing where everything is. And I'm wondering if you can run us through both what it's like on the ground there in Israel and kind of how the allies are feeling. I mean, according to your article, the death toll is now up to 1,332 people dead, and strikes still continuing throughout the region. Although, as we just talked about, Iran's leader, temporary leader, came out and essentially apologized and saying they weren't going to strike these regional allies unless they were taking direct strikes. How are people feeling on the ground? How are governments reacting? And is anything changing as we go into this second week?
Jeff noted the ebullience of the U.S. president about progress in this war. I think that would definitely be shared by the Israeli leadership and indeed the bulk of the Israeli populace, to judge by recent polls. There's wide support for this in Israel, despite Israel having taken quite a few of those missile and drone attacks. There was a slight reprieve in the early hours of Friday of about 10 hours, but those have assumed overnight. I spent half the night in a shelter, as did many of the people across the country. When it comes to the Gulf, I think the mood is very different. You have US-aligned Gulf Arab powers whose success, especially in recent years, has been built on husbanding their energy wealth, their reputations for financial stability, and they're seeing that being shattered by this war that erupted around them, by the Iranian attacks. Iran says those have targeted US assets hosted by those Gulf Arab countries. However, one can very clearly see from video footage that some of them have also been hitting civilian sites, hotels and the like, which will doubtless also hurt tourism, certainly hurting aviation now. This war is a week old. Planners seem to think it's on track, perhaps even ahead of track, and that the Iranian firepower is naturally waning. That would appear to be the case. Iran itself says 40% of its firepower has been directed at Israel. Israel, however, is creeping towards some normalcy with a gradual reopening of workplaces and the airport for civilian flights. However, I think we should look into the coming week as to whether the war planners, US and the Israeli war planners here, feel sufficiently confident to begin signaling to the Iranian opposition that it's safe to come out and challenge what remains of the regime for the future running of that country, Iran.
Elise Labott, the thing that we've noticed most here since the beginning is how the now former Supreme Leader, the late Supreme Leader's promise of a regional war has come to pass here. And you've written about that on your newsletter, the preamble. You write, the reason Iran's Gulf neighbors were never eager for this war is now playing out in real time across their skylines. They knew they lived in the blast radius. They knew Iran would lash out. That is precisely why they spent years hedging, trading, mediating, doing everything short of choosing a side. What they did not anticipate was the scale. Let's go there. Let's talk about the scale. That speech from the Iranian president this morning, what we're hearing from the president today, this effort on the part of these Gulf leaders here to maybe slow things down and stop the spread of this war across the region.
Well, that's right, David. And basically what the Iranians were doing was kind of spreading out across the region to show how bad it could get for everybody, to make those Gulf countries feel the pain. These countries in the Gulf have spent decades kind of trying to establish this safe zone in the region. It's fun. It's very financially lucrative. Business people can go there. And this is to really shatter that safety and security that people feel in the Gulf, and to try and make the pain so great that these leaders try to convince the United States to, slow it down. What was happening was there was a lot of talk in the region about these countries joining the U.S. effort. I mean, they don't have clearly as many defenses or offensive weapons as the United States or Israel, but there was talk about the UAE, about Saudi Arabia joining, really trying to all protect each other in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And so I think it actually is a pretty tactical move on the part of the Iranians to say to the Gulf countries, listen, this isn't against you. This is against the United States and Israel. We won't attack you if those U.S. drones or those U.S. missiles come, unless they come from one of the bases in your country. If a missile or a drone doesn't come from your country, we won't attack you. And that is an effort to convince those countries to push the United States to cool it down. We know that these countries were not thrilled in the beginning, as I said, because they knew that they would be the ones that were attacked.
Jeff, I want to ask you, do we know who the president has been talking to? I mean, you heard Elise mention all those allies are not happy. They've also been saying they're upset that they didn't get any kind of notice about these strikes, even to the point where we've seen they've had to retaliate. They've had to shoot down incoming munitions. They weren't given any kind of heads up. They couldn't stockpile any of those, and they couldn't evacuate people or give people warnings. Has President Trump been taking calls, making calls to any of these leaders? Do we know what the communications have been back and forth?
Well, just on that other broader point that you made, the United States itself didn't give warnings to its, or at least apparently didn't give warnings to its embassies and to people in the region, because there were a bunch of Americans stranded in the region over the last week too.
Yeah, there was an authorized departure that went out for the American embassy in Israel, but it went out, an authorized departure isn't an evacuation order. It is, if you would like to leave, you can. And it was gently worded, and it wasn't necessarily a signal that Americans in the region or elsewhere should get out. And to your point, it wasn't regional. I'm sorry, Jeff, continue.
No, not at all. I mean, and I think it's the regional point that I was making too, is that these are other countries who are allies that have U.S. personnel on the ground, or at the very least diplomats, and that was either not part of the plan, or it was not, or it was deemed too risky in terms of the possibility of getting of leaking the plans out to the wider world. I don't know the answer to your question about who he's been talking to. I certainly he's been having a lot of meetings this week with his own officials and his own advisors about the war. I have no doubt that they've been in close touch with Israel, but they have not. The White House hasn't been providing readouts of other countries in the region with whom he is talking. I do think it's important to note that the change in tone, or the change in plan, I guess, from the Iranians is a shift from a week ago in terms of political risk. One of their initial plans in terms of retaliation was to retaliate against their neighbors, to up the pressure on the United States. And the fact that they're now saying they're not going to attack countries that aren't attacking Iran may actually have the the alternate effect of giving those countries an opportunity to create some diplomatic channels, which don't appear to be open right now between the United States and its main target.
Dan, a thread we're going to come back to time and time again this morning, and I suspect tomorrow as well, is just the changing motivations for and rationale for this war here in the U.S. And I'm curious, your sense of how Prime Minister Netanyahu's rationale and reasons and designs for prosecuting this war are very much the same as President Trump's or different? How much daylight is there between the two, do you think?
Well, I think they're very close. I mean, you're better placed to judge. It seems to me that the muddled messaging, such as it has been in Washington, has been over downstream effects of this war, specifically the potential duration and the question of a post-war leadership in Iran. When it comes to the immediate reasons for this war, there appears to be some consistency there, not just within the US system, but also when it comes to Israeli statements, a focus on the Iranian nuclear program, what remains of it. And it's worth remembering that despite losing or seeing their 3 major uranium enrichment sites battered by those B-2s half a year ago, by every account, the Iranians retained enough highly enriched uranium that within about a week of subjecting it to further enrichment, that could produce enough fuel for 10 to 11 bombs. There was no doubt they had a vestigial program there, or a vestigial resource, if you like. There's also the ballistic missile program, which apparently they've been rebuilding apace, and the Navy, which we all know has had the ability to affect energy distribution from the Gulf in the Strait of Hormuz by threatening shipping there. I don't see a huge amount of daylight. I do think those immediate goals have been consistently stated. And when it comes to downstream future effects of this war, yes, there is a muddled messaging there, but I think that's potentially a matter of simply the unforeseeable aspects of a war like this, a war that's taken in some dozen or more countries now and appears to be spilling over in ways no one anticipated.
All right, Dan Williams, Bloomberg's Jerusalem reporter, Jeff Mason, our White House reporter, and Elise Labott, author of Cosmopolitan Substack. Elise, we're going to be back with you later in the show, so thank you for sticking with us. Really interesting. The messaging coming from the White House this morning, I cannot remember during an active military campaign a president coming out and pre-signaling what the day's attacks are going to look like.
Yeah, and kind of runs counter to what we've seen from the administration over these last few days. That is this very brash stance from the defense secretary, among others. We're not going to say what we're going to do. We're keeping our cards very close. We don't want to reveal that to the press, to the American people, to the enemy, what our plans might be. Again, this post from the president on Truth Social this morning, incredibly forceful, saying that there is going to be a significant attack here on Saturday morning.
Normally you don't telegraph your moves, and this is the all options are on the table administration, but very forceful words from the president this morning.
We're going to come back to that throughout the morning here on Bloomberg this weekend. Coming up, my conversation with former Secretary of State Antony Blinken on how the rising price of oil, rising price of gasoline could determine the outcome of this war.
And we'll have Michael McKee, Bloomberg's TV's and radio's international economics and policy correspondent, joining us live on set, straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Welcome back live with Bloomberg this morning. Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the stories you need to know. And we're starting with this. The war in Iran showing no signs of slowing. President Trump posting on Truth Social this morning a warning saying that the U.S. will consider striking areas and groups of people in the Iran conflict that were not yet considered for targeting until now. Now, the president's post, it comes in response to headlines out at Tehran that says Iran's president has informed Iranian armed forces not to attack or launch missiles at neighboring countries unless attacked from there. In a televised speech, he apologized to neighboring countries for being attacked by Iran. Now, meanwhile, Israel launched another wave of strikes on Tehran as the Islamic Republic had targeted missiles at Israel. Countries in Europe and Asia have been moving to boost the region's defenses. The conflict in the Middle East has left more than 1,300 people dead in Iran so far. Dozens of others have been killed elsewhere in the region in retaliatory strikes. Now, President Donald Trump said he would also travel to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware today, and that is to attend the transfer ceremony for U.S. service members who were killed in the conflict. Right now, U.S. troops, 6 troops, were reported to have died in those strikes. In other news, at least 6 other people were killed Friday in Michigan and Oklahoma, and this is as powerful storms have produced tornadoes in the area. Many homes reduced to rubble with the destruction, leaving a trail of debris hanging from power lines. According to the National Storm Prediction Center, nearly 25 million Americans were facing severe weather risks. And the battle is over between Novo Nordisk and Hims & Hers Health. Sources telling Bloomberg that Novo plans to sell its weight loss drugs on Hims & Hers Health's platform. Now, a partnership could be announced as soon as Monday. The two companies had a similar agreement last year, but Novo scrapped it after Hims & Hers refused to stop marketing and selling copycat medications. Now, David and Christina, shares of Hims & Hers actually soared 40% in after-hours trading yesterday.
Big deal. It's been a fractious fight between those two for
I know a lot of people
long
have been using that service, so
Correct.
it's good for them. They got that worked out.
Lisa Mateo, thank you very much. David Gura here alongside Christina Ruffini. And earlier this week for the Big Take podcast, I sat down with former Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the two of us talked a lot about the war in Iran, and here are some of his thoughts on how he thinks it's going to proceed.
It seems to me that there are two critical factors to look at. Markets and munitions. Markets. Where are the oil markets? Where's the stock market? Where's the bond market? I know President Trump is very attentive to those. And if they go in a southerly direction and stay that way, or in the case of oil in a northerly direction, that's going to be possibly a limiting factor. Then munitions. There's really a race on to figure out who expends their munitions first and fastest. The Iranians put us in a position where we've used up a lot of interceptors to deal with defense, or even our offensive missiles to take out their launchers, or conversely, did they run out and we still have what we need? I don't know the numbers here. I'm not privy to that, but it is something we have to be very, very attentive to because these things are not in infinite supply.
Markets and munitions sounds like a deep cut track from Hamilton. But we're going to get to the second part of that, munitions, later this hour. We want to start with what a lot of people are talking about this morning, and that's oil and gasoline prices. They're at levels we haven't seen in years. For more, we are joined by Michael McKee, Bloomberg TV and Radio's international economics and policy correspondent, and Julian Lee, an oil strategist for Bloomberg News, joining us out of London. Mike, I'm going to start with you since you're here on set with us. Thank you so much for coming in this early. All three major indexes all dropped about 1% as oil and gas surged. Tell us what's going on with the markets. What are investors looking at and where we think this might be going?
Well, there's sort of a dividing line. Initially, people thought this was going to be very short. The other military engagements the president's involved us in have been very short. The longer it goes, the more concerned people get about what the impact on the economy is. And a lot of that has to do with how Americans are going to be feeling about this conflict and whether or not they'll pull back on spending. And we've seen CEOs across the country, because of tariffs, sitting on their hands, not sure what to do. And this just prolongs that.
And an oil problem can become an everything problem.
An oil problem can become an everything problem, but it's not like it was in the 1970s. And a lot of people have made that comparison. We're much less energy dependent. We use much less energy to an oil for each unit of output that we make these days. And so it is less likely to be a recession in the United States. We might see slower growth, but it's not as much of a danger as it would appear. It's more of a political danger to the administration because, of course, people hate the idea of rising gasoline prices.
Interesting.
Julian Lee, let's talk about how the global oil market is adjusting as a result of what's been happening here over the last few days. We'll talk about the U.S. in just a moment. But looking at it globally, we've seen the startling images of how little traffic there is in the Strait of Hormuz, heard about how some countries, including Saudi Arabia, are trying to reroute a lot of the oil they're producing. Just give us a broad look at the way in which the global energy industry is trying to change as a result of what's happening here.
Well, I mean, historically, about between 17 and 20 million barrels a day of oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz. About 15 to 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Since the beginning of March, virtually nothing has left. The straits are effectively closed. They're not physically closed, but threats of attacks and attacks that have been carried out on ships transiting the straits have created a situation where owners and crews and charterers don't want to take vessels through. That has left a real problem for both oil and gas. We did a survey the end of last week. There are about 75 super tankers inside in the Gulf. Almost 50 of those are full. Others are being used for long-term storage or are related to the Iranian trade. We calculated there were just 9 tankers that were empty. Each tanker can take about 5 hours worth of total Saudi production. So, you've got about 4 days worth of Saudi production that can still be put onto tankers in the Gulf. And that's if nobody else produces anything. We've already seen reports that both Iraq and Kuwait are cutting back their production because their storage tanks on land are full and they don't have anywhere else to put the oil. Saudi Arabia, as you said, is diverting crude across to the Red Sea. But that route isn't sufficient to take all of its exports. So we have a backlog and oil isn't getting out. And while the West and the US in particular is much less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than it was back in the 1970s, the price is global. So if China and India can't get the oil that they need from the Middle East, they're going to try and get it from somewhere else. Prices are going to go up for everybody.
You bring up India. I want to play a bit of tape here of Kevin Hassett, the president's chief economic advisor. He was on Bloomberg TV yesterday after the jobs report came out, and he was asked about the way that the White House is looking at the global energy market right now. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about what the White House is considering doing and indeed starting to do.
The sanction waiver that Secretary Bessent came out with is just one of many, many tools that we have ready. We've got a whole flow chart of tools to use depending on this or that, and we're ready to move them as soon as we have to. But we're also very optimistic that we're going to be able to get this near-term problem resolved relatively quickly.
Michael McKee, get us up to speed on what Kevin Hassett is talking about there. We heard from the Treasury Secretary this willingness to relax sanctions on Russia to get oil to India. He's indicated there might be an expansion of that in the days ahead. Talk a bit about the significance of that in light of the really robust sanctions that have been placed on Russia since the start of the war in Ukraine.
Well, this is a bit of good news for Russia in the sense that they can sell more oil now. The U.S. and India had just reached a deal where India said it would no longer buy Russian crude, and that would have crimped the Kremlin's ability to fund its Ukraine war. And now, to keep prices down, the president's going to let India buy more oil. The other question that follows from that is, will they let China buy more oil? Because they, too, are under the sanctions. So it's a good thing for Russia. It doesn't really help the U.S. that much because, as Julian said, oil is a globally priced commodity. So we'll see if it has a major impact. But right now, it's not. And we're in that phase of the war where for investors, for traders, you trade first and ask questions later. There's an emotional component to this of things are going up, so let's get ahead of that. And then we can figure out what the actual outcome damage is going to be.
Julian, my other question about this is, had India and or China ever really stopped buying Russian oil? Because this is one of the issues, how to get them to stop. There was talk about secondary sanctions that they never really followed through with any kind of effective capacity. Is this really going to make that much difference realistically, or is this just kind of a diplomatic coup for Moscow?
Well, I think for Moscow it is a huge win, and they are so far they are the only clear winner out of a week of war in Iran. This does two things for Russia. It allows them to boost their sales to India. India had roughly halved its purchases of Russian crude since late last year when President Trump imposed these extra tariffs on India. China has really just skated over all of this. It continues to buy Russian oil. It stepped in to take most of what India wasn't taking over the last couple of months. But the big hit for Russia was that it had to offer ever deeper discounts in order to shift those barrels. What I think this waiver does is it allows it to boost its sales to India, and it allows it to reduce the discounts that it has to offer against global benchmarks. So, it's a win-win for Moscow.
Mike McKee, something else that Kevin Hassett was asked about was whether the U.S. would consider or is considering releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. There's a lot in it. They have been refilling it. What did he say about that? And Walk us through the calculus of this administration as they, with some alarm, are looking at the midterms looming on the horizon here and seeing this really precipitous rise in prices over the last week.
Former Energy Secretary Moniz was on Bloomberg this week talking about their decision during that administration to release from that reserve. And even he was saying it's not always a good idea.
Well, at this point, the administration feels it's not a good idea. Kevin Hassett said they're not considering it at the moment. It's always on the table because you have it, but it's less than half full because it hasn't been refilled from the Biden administration letting it go. So there's a concern that if you use that now, you will run dry too early in what might be a lengthy problem getting oil. So it's not likely to happen in the short term, but the administration is, David, as you suggest, sort of flailing about, trying to find a way to mitigate the pain, mitigate the headlines. There was even some talk of the Treasury Department getting involved in buying oil futures, which would have been something that's never happened before. And of course, if the words unlimited liability mean anything to you, it could have put us in that situation where the U.S. could lose billions and billions of dollars. So it isn't clear what their strategy is at this point because, as we keep noting, gasoline prices keep going up and keep going up by record amounts each day.
Our Michael McKee, international economics and policy correspondent, joining us on set here. We're going to come back with Mike in a bit. He was speaking to a lot of Fed officials over the course of the week. They, of course, taking note of the fact these energy prices are rising. Going to hear some sound from his interviews with a number of them a little bit later in the show. And our thanks to Julian Lee as well, oil strategist for Bloomberg News based in London, joining us here on this Saturday. Julian, thanks to you as well.
And of course, we're following breaking news this morning. President Trump posting within the last hour that, quote, today Iran will be hit very hard. Our military experts join us next after the break to see what exactly we think that's going to mean, coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. Now, we want to get you up to date with some of the top stories, and we're starting with the war in Iran. And it looks like the cancellation of an army exercise, well, that's fueling some speculation about troop deployments to the Middle East. Now, this is a story from the Washington Post, and they're reporting that the Army halted a major training exercise for the headquarter element. This is the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The division, it specializes in ground combat, other missions, and includes a brigade combat team of about 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. Now, no deployment orders have been issued. In other news, we have the president making a promise when it comes to overhauling college sports.
So we're going to do an executive order, and I think it's going to be an executive order that the people in this room and the students and the colleges will be proud of. Whether or not it holds up in court, I can't tell you that. But you're not going to get it through the Senate. And you're probably not going to get anything through the House because you have a bunch of lunatics that you have to deal with.
President Trump spoke with lawmakers, college sports luminaries yesterday. It was a meeting over athletes' salaries, transfers, and the impact of gambling. He said he planned to issue the executive order within 1 week, but also acknowledged that it would likely face legal challenges, saying, quote, whether or not it holds up in court, I can't tell you that. Well, sticking with sports, the U.S., they kicked off their start to the World Baseball Classic last night. A big win. Captain Aaron Judge, he hit a 2-run homer to lead the team 15-5 win over Brazil. Today, Brazil faces Italy. The U.S. plays Britain. David and Christina, the last time the U.S. won the World Baseball Classic, 2017. Right. So it's every few years. So we'll see if we can
You're an Aaron Judge
pick
fan?
it up. I am a huge Yankees. Hello.
Suspected as much.
Sports ball. Sports ball.
Lisa, thank you very much.
You got it.
Some new reporting this morning from the New York Times revealing Russia is sharing intelligence with Iran, including satellite imagery showing the location of warships and military personnel. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth told 60 Minutes that the U.S. is aware of all intelligence sharing and is working to mitigate any risks.
We have the best intelligence in the world. We're aware of who's talking to who, why they're talking to them, how accurate that information might be, how we factor that into our battle plans, our CENTCOM commander. So we know what's going on, and the president has an incredible knack at knowing how to mitigate those risks. And so the American people can rest assured their commander-in-chief is well aware of who's talking to who, and anything that shouldn't be happening, whether it's in public or back-channeled, is being confronted and confronted strongly.
All right, we want to go now to retired Colonel Wayne Sanders. He is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Defense Analyst, and Becca Wasser. She's Bloomberg Economics Defense Lead. Becca, I want to start with you. Do we know, okay, yes, the Russians are sharing intelligence with Iran, but it's unclear if they've actually used that intelligence yet or if they helped them in strikes. Do we know how far this goes and how it's being utilized?
We don't know exactly how far it goes at this point in time, but right now it's worth putting this in a broader context. This is an existential fight for Iran. So they're going to seek help wherever it is that they can possibly find it. And they've had a great alignment with Russia over the past few years. In fact, Iranian-produced drones, the Shaheds that we have seen them use to great effect in attacks on places like the Gulf states and US bases throughout the region, they actually exported those to Russia, and Russia has been using them in its own fight against Ukraine. So here there is this alignment, and there's almost a sense of Iran trying to seek help because it needs it, but trying to get a little bit of what it has already provided to Russia. So I expect that we're going to see additional support being requested from Russia, possibly even China, by Iran in the coming days.
And Becca, you heard Secretary of Defense say we have the best intelligence in the world. We're aware of who's talking to who, should be whom, but I'll move on from that. But what can the U.S. do about it? Yes, they're aware of it, but how does can the U.S. stop this from happening?
Honestly, the U.S. probably can stop it from happening in some ways, but there's a question of, is it worth doing? And yes, obviously, trying to reduce Iran's ability to have a better targeting picture, to be able to be more accurate in its strikes, would be something that's really important. And here, there's a bunch of different ways where the U.S. could do it, depending on the ways in which this is intelligence being shared. If it's space-based intelligence, there are ways to try and reduce Russia's ability to see a good picture and provide it to Iran. There's also ways to cut off some of those communications by Russia and Iran. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, is that where the U.S. wants to put the predominance of its effort? Does it need to potentially use some resources that once you use them, you can't really use them again because they are discoverable in certain ways? So it really depends on the prioritization that the White House and the Department of Defense have, and frankly, the intelligence community has, or whether they're going to focus their efforts and their resources on other parts of the fight, particularly as President Trump has said that a big attack is coming, and also some of the efforts to try and reduce the risks to U.S. forces and allies and partners in the region.
That threat of a big attack coming in that post from the president this morning on Truth Social. Colonel, I want to go to you next. We've been talking about some of the themes from the interview that I did with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, former Secretary of State, earlier this week. He talked about how determining factors here might be markets and munitions. And focusing on that munitions part, we had a meeting at the White House yesterday of executives from many big defense companies. The president saying we concluded a very good meeting with them. We discussed production and production schedules. They've agreed to quadruple production of the exquisite class weaponry, and that we want to reach as rapidly as possible the highest levels of quantity. I want to ask you about that in a minute, but first, let's play a little bit of tape here from retired General Petraeus, who was on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio yesterday.
We're going to have to dramatically increase our industrial capacity. By the way, we also have to transform our forces. We need to change our very concepts of war. We have to change our very doctrine, and then we have to dramatically change what it is that we're buying and also how we buy it. It needs to be updated constantly, not say a million of exactly this over the next 4 years.
So, Colonel, let's focus on the munitions side of this. What was discussed at that meeting yesterday, and how acute, in your estimation, the need is here for these defense companies to produce more at this moment as we enter the second week of this war?
Thanks so much for having me. You know, when you look at the main companies that they're looking at here is really going to be the winners, Lockheed, Northrop, and RTX, based off of the munitions that they are providing. So these exquisite ones that they're talking about includes JASSM missiles, LRASMs, PAC-3 interceptors for air defense, the THAAD system, as well as the PRISM. Northrop, you've got solid rocket motors, boosters in their Sentinel missile program. And then RTX, you've got Tomahawks, Sidewinders, and SM-6s. Why do I say that? Is because there was already a big focus on critical munitions production ramp up. And now that they have all agreed to be able to do this, this becomes a really big piece, because those are going to be some of the same ones that would be used in a China contingency in 2027 or beyond. So they want to make sure that they have adequate numbers to be able to sustain not only their stockpiles and replenish those, but then also make sure that if they're needed for any further parts of the Iran conflict, they can be. You heard Secretary Hexeth earlier in the week talk about transitioning away from those exquisite standoff weapons and then moving into gravity-fed. Gravity-fed becomes very important because those don't need solid rocket motors. They don't need those. Those are gravity-fed, and there's no electronic warfare to get in the way of these precision-guided munitions from hitting their targets. And we have them in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, as opposed to the numbers that you would have for these other long-strike weapons.
And Colonel, very quickly before we have to go, there's a bit of a disconnect here, because the Secretary saying we're fine, we have enough munitions, we can keep this going as long as we need to. And there's also reporting this week that the U.S. is talking to folks like South Korea about possibly redeploying batteries from there to this front. I'm wondering why they would need to do that, and if that's even realistic.
I think as you move into this part of the fight, too, I think it also goes into some of the South Korean weapon systems, especially in air defense, do a great job and all that. They are lower cost and lower yield. So if you can actually use those, why not use those and save those for contingencies? But I don't believe that the U.S. entered this fight going, OK, we only have enough missiles for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even 4 weeks from a contingency perspective, because that all went into the planning and wargaming before this decision was ever made from the military side. They know they have China as a potential consideration for Taiwan unification in 2027. So all of that would have been part of that military calculation, military calculus that they do before they even entered this war.
Colonel, thank you very much. That's Colonel Wayne Sanders joining us alongside Becca Wasser, our colleagues here at Bloomberg. Thank you very much for the time on this Saturday. And coming up, Lisa Mateo sifting through it right now. This morning's front pages with Lisa coming up.
And as you go about your day, take us with you no matter where you go. Watch on Bloomberg TV, listen on Bloomberg Radio, stream us live on the Bloomberg Business app. Wherever you are, we're there. It's Bloomberg This Weekend. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura and Lisa Mateo, who's going to run us through some of the front pages from other places you may have missed this morning. There's been a lot of focus on Iran, but there is a lot of other stuff going on, as well as different Iran news we haven't gotten to yet.
Correct. And that's what we want to get to right now. Some of those different stories that we haven't touched upon too much. This one is from Bloomberg. Let's get right to the headline. It says U.S. military relying on AI as tool to speed Iran operations. So the technology allowing human analysts to focus on higher level analysis and also verification. Basically, this is a testament to the technology's growth in warfare. There was a spokesperson for the U.S. Central Command who tells Bloomberg that the military is using these AI tools to manage large amounts of data for operations against Iran. It was a spokesperson, Captain Timothy Hawkins. He didn't actually name the tools of other companies that provide them to the military, but he did say it helps them make smarter decisions faster. There was something named. Sources are telling Bloomberg that it's a digital mission control platform. It's called Maven Smart System. So then you get to the companies involved with it. So it's produced by Palantir. The system's also using Anthropic's Claude AI tool, which is interesting with Anthropic because you know everything that Anthropic has been going through with the Pentagon as well.
Absolutely. We had earlier this week it being labeled a supply chain risk by the government. Lo, this continues. A fascinating piece by Christina Manson, who joined us on our first weekend to talk about this, has really been tracking it closely, Christina. But I think that's something that's really notable about this moment, this conflict, the way that AI is playing a role publicly in the way that we haven't talked about in the past.
100%. I did not realize, and you know, I've covered the Pentagon, you've covered the Pentagon, I did not realize they were using AI to this extent for things like intelligence gathering and even targeting. It's unclear which exactly of these targets were using AI, but you can bet that was involved in most of these strikes because it's so integrated into the weapon systems at this point.
And that Project Maven that you mentioned, which Palantir is producing, I think funnels in like 150 different sources, uses Claude. Just fascinating how important, how critical this is going to be. And we played a little bit of tape from that interview with Secretary Hegseth earlier. It's going to be fascinating to see what he has to say tomorrow night on 60 Minutes as well.
Exactly. All right, I want to keep it here with Iran, but this one's a little bit different. This one's from the BBC. Okay, so the headline is "Everything Has Changed: Missile Attacks Shatter Dubai's Safe Haven Image." So basically, it's talking about how Dubai has been this safe haven, right, for residents in an unstable, wider region. But you know, this sunny, shiny place for the rich from other people, you know, from other countries that they call home. You have expats pursuing some business opportunities. opportunities, travel. Then you have the influencers who use it as a backdrop to their glamorous life. So that's what this kind of focuses on, is how these influencers are now telling the BBC that they're kind of second guessing their plans to do all these glamorous things there. So now you have a lot of them coming on and talking about what they're seeing and some of the things and how their family is kind of experiencing life in the middle of all this, when people are used to them posting about these glamorous times that they're having in Dubai. So it's sort of this change that's going on social media.
And this is really getting to that as well. I mean, the fact that it's shattered this vision of
Yes.
what the Middle East,
Yes.
this part of the Middle East has been like historically.
And if you follow any of these influencers, or if you follow people who follow them, there's been a very interesting thread where obviously there's been pushback from the governments, especially in Qatar and UAE, saying we are a safe place, trying to maintain that image. And there's clearly some sort of messaging going through, because you're seeing influencers usually post about breakfast and purses, all of a sudden posting about how they feel secure and they trust their leadership and they trust the government and they still feel safer there than other places in the world. And they're all very similar across countries and across influencers.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, well, criticism of the government, illegal in the UAE. So that's a side note there.
Yes.
This next one from the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so when you talk about prediction markets, right? Okay, so let's get to it. It's the wildest frat party on campus. Prediction markets. Okay, so Kalshi Poly Market, they're pouring money into deals with social media influencers, students who try and parlay rumors, insider information into cash. Okay, so these companies, they're targeting college students because you can place bets on prediction markets at 18 years old, unlike
because it's regulated.
Yeah, because it's unregulated.
Yeah,
Exactly. So Polymarket's offering to pay fraternities in exchange for signing up users. So if you want to get to specifics, how much? One frat raised more than $30,000 over 2 weeks by doing this. So they throw these massive parties. But it's not just frats. It's these college student influencers, too, who are promoting these markets. You know, they're hiring students, athletes, at brand representatives, all these kind of things, even some insider trading kind of things going on within the fraternities.
Yes, I noted that the stepson of Jeff Bezos is invoked in the piece as being a frat brother, I think at the University of Miami.
Yes,
and there
because
was some
it was
speculation, will Jeff Bezos be at the Super Bowl or not? And certainly he might have had some insight. What's your last story, Lisa? We got time
okay,
for one
this is
more.
for the weekend. Okay, this is from Bloomberg The Weekend. Roblox minting teen millionaires. Roblox creators are taking hundreds of thousands a month from simple games like Fish. So Roblox is a digital mall with access to millions of games, right? You can play, you can chat, you can create. If the games catch on, they make money from fans who are buying these digital items for their characters. Roblox played about $1.5 billion to game creators last year, and then you have all these teen millionaires, one at 19 making $400,000 a month.
I told my kids about this. They were
Do they
intrigued.
play? Really?
No? They casually
Roblox?
play, but the prospect of making $400,000 a month was an interesting thing for them. Anyway, Cecilia Anastasio, who wrote that piece, nobody covers gaming as well as she does. She's here.
She's very cool. We're going to have her on sometime.
Absolutely. All right, for more from the Bloomberg Weekend team, subscribe to the Weekend newsletter at Bloomberg.com/newsletters. Lisa, thank you.
We're coming up on 8 a.m. here in New York. President Trump threatening to hit Iran very hard today. The president expected to speak later this morning from Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, a busy day for the president. So we've been talking about this over the course of the morning. The president posted this post on Truth Social this morning
Quite
indicating
early,
he is upset with what he's heard from the Iranian president, intends to strike Iran quite hard on this Saturday. Of course, we're monitoring all those headlines as they come across. He's in Florida. He's going to go to Delaware for this dignified transfer of those 6 troops who died in the war thus far. Then he's going back to Florida, as I understand it, Christina, for this summit of Latin American leaders that's been on the books for some time
Which
here.
was supposed to be early in the morning and has now been pushed to the afternoon so that he can get to Dover and back, I'm sure.
A lot being pushed here, and we understand there'll be some remarks from the president over the course of the day as well. So we'll be monitoring all of that as the day unfolds here, right here on Bloomberg This Weekend. So our coverage of that continues here. Stay with us. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend coming up, we're going to have a lot of great guests, talk a lot more about Iran, the energy markets, the economy, those jobs numbers, which came out yesterday. It'll be a focus of ours as well, as we have Michael McKee returning to set with us here at Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend on this Saturday. It's 8 a.m. in New York from Bloomberg's global news headquarters here in Midtown Manhattan. We're bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, analysis live this morning and every weekend from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock a.m. And Christina, we've been tracking what the president has been saying, what he's been writing early on this Saturday morning, this tweet from the president about what's next in Iran.
Exactly. It was a very forceful statement from a president who's not usually active quite at this hour. Usually we see them in the twilight hours, but the president has a very busy day. As we mentioned, he's going to Dover for this dignified transfer of these U.S. service members coming back. Then he goes back to Florida for this summit, Shield of America. For those tracking this is part of Noem, DHS Secretary's new job. She will be in charge or at the helm of, it's a little bit unclear, something to do with that. But this goes to show how many fronts the president is working on at the time, right? He's got Venezuela, he's got the Western Hemisphere, which he said has really wanted to be a focus of this administration. He's got Iran, and there are rumors and things we'll get into later that he might have his eye on Cuba and other places as well.
Yeah, raising the specter of that in that interview with Dana Bash of CNN yesterday, that Cuba's leadership days are numbered as well. Let me just read a little bit from the tweet that the president posted this morning. It's a long one. I'll skip the preamble, but get to the most important part. That's at the end. Today, Iran will be hit very hard. Under serious consideration for complete destruction and certain death because of Iran's bad behavior are areas and groups of people that were not considered for targeting up until this moment in time. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump.
All right, on that note, we're going to go to Lisa for headlines. Lisa, what you got for us at 8 a.m.?
All right, so that latest warning from the president, right? It comes after he said the only deal he would accept with Iran would be, quote, unconditional surrender. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt explained.
What the president means is that when he, as commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, determines that Iran no longer poses a threat to the United States of America and the goals of Operation Epic Fury has been fully realized, then Iran will essentially be in a place of unconditional surrender. Whether they say it themselves or not, frankly, they don't have a lot of people to say that for them.
In the meantime, Washington pushing back on worries around surging energy costs. The U.S. prices at the pump rose Friday to the highest since September 2024. Brent crude settled at over $92 a barrel. Now, oil traders, they're warning that prices could reach $100 a barrel within days, with shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz all but halted. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett explained how the White House is looking at the oil market and reserves. To Bloomberg.
There is no conversation right now to dip into that, but we've got something like 400 million barrels ready to go if needed. But there is, I reemphasize, that there has not been a conversation to dip into that yet, because our expectation is that this effort in Iran is way ahead of schedule. And we understand that there are near-term market fluctuations, but we have our eyes on the horizon.
The military campaign has also roiled equity and bond markets worldwide. Dubai's Emirates, it plans to resume operations after flights were temporarily suspended following disruptions caused by another round of interceptions. Dubai International Airport also temporarily suspended operations. Retaliatory strikes from Iran led the UAE to shut down its airspace and cause minor structural damage to the hub in Dubai. Now, David and Christina airlines in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, they have also had their operations halted as well.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. We're going to get right to it. We've got a really good panel for you to start off this hour. Vivian Salama, she's a staff writer at The Atlantic. Nancy Cook, Bloomberg News senior national political correspondent. And back with us is Jeff Mason, our Washington White House correspondent. Vivian, I want to start with you because you write in an interesting piece this week. You point out the fact that in some of these other places where President Trump has taken military action, including Venezuela, one of the first things he's talked about is the oil. We have not really heard that rhetoric from him in this conflict. As we are all here talking about oil prices and what this could do to the economy, we are not hearing the kind of rhetoric from the president we usually do about the U.S. going in, taking over oil markets, trying to profit somehow from a very expensive conflict. Why do you think that is?
Well, partly, Christina, because advisors around him are pointing out exactly what you just laid out, that the energy markets are very rattled by this conflict. You have U.S. service members being killed. You just mentioned he's going to Dover later today. It is the gravity of the situation is such that his advisors, also some allies in the region, have advised him that focusing on anything other than the mission at hand is only going to exacerbate the situation, and particularly the economy that's been so rattled by this, because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, because of the fact that, Qatar cannot produce LNG at the moment and don't know when they will resume. So all of those factors leading to gas prices going up in a critical midterm election year. And the White House just does not want to rattle things even further. And so any talk from the president of the United States about going in, claiming energy, claiming the oil in Iran, that could really just dump fuel on the fire, no pun intended. And so that is why he's kind of steered clear of that for now.
For now, Jeff Mason, we read a little bit from the president's post this morning, and I'm very curious as we watch guests arrive at this summit that's taking place at the president's Gulf Resort in Florida, the Doral Gulf Resort, officials and leaders from Latin America. Your sense of what the president means, difficult to parse a tweet for concrete details about what a mission might entail, but perhaps you can help us understand the change in tone or what we should read into what the president wrote this morning about what's likely to happen over the course of the day.
I mean, I think what you can read into that is that he's irritated that Iran is not just bowing to his will. And he has, they decided over a week ago to stop negotiations because U.S. officials concluded that Iran was not seriously willing to talk about giving up its ballistic missile program and was still intent on pursuing a nuclear bomb. So that was what led, in part, at least, to President Trump making the decision to start the military action. Then in the course of this last week, he has encouraged, I think he did it again yesterday, or at least the day before, he has encouraged the Iranian National Guard and police and everyone who's fighting to lay down their arms and give up. And that's just not what the Iranians are doing. And so that's annoying to him, irritating to him. And as a result, he is changing his rhetoric and saying that we're going to increase our attacks even further.
Nancy, I want to ask you, because this war is hitting quite close to home, and it's been getting some interesting reactions from Trump's base, the MAGA base. As you write, quote, the Iran war has emerged as a grave political vulnerability for Republicans ahead of a midterm election in which they're counting on the voters who delivered Trump a second term to keep their party in majority on Capitol Hill. Trump's agenda on everything from spending to trade will be hamstrung if Democrats wrest control of even one chamber of Congress. Is there a way for Trump and Republicans to get out from under this, or is this a huge problem for them going into November?
Well, I think it's a large problem for them going into November because, as Vivian said earlier, we're facing potentially higher energy prices. And also, just more philosophically, this is not what the MAGA base signed up for. They signed up for a president who had an America First agenda, who did not want to get embroiled in conflicts in the Middle East. He was very critical of President Bush's incursion into Iraq. He was very critical of President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. His message as a candidate since his 2016 campaign has been no more forever wars. It's a much more isolationist message. And now we've seen him really engage in a lot of military intervention, first in Venezuela, now in Iran. His advisors are also eyeing leadership changes in Cuba. And so it's just a real philosophical break with what the MAGA base expected for him. And they're not happy about it. You have a bunch of MAGA voices like Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly making a lot of noise. Some Republican lawmakers are privately quite worried about this. And so, it's just another thing along with the Epstein files, along with the economy, where the base is not really happy with the job that he's doing.
Can't commend this piece enough. MAGA is split. Trump digs in on Iran war, divides loyalists, by Nancy and Josh Green, our colleague here at Bloomberg. And Nancy, I'm curious, you say they're making a lot of noise, the likes of Megyn Kelly, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the now former representative. I'm curious sort of how they see their currency at this moment. I think there's been some dismissiveness from this White House about the criticism that they've gotten. We certainly saw that in the context of this war powers vote that took place earlier this week. Thomas Massie, the Republican from Kentucky, chief proponent of that. Do they feel like this moment is different, the MAGA crowd, and do they feel like they have the currency here to kind of change or make a difference in terms of the way the president sees some of these issues?
Well, I think the MAGA crowd is making a lot of noise right now. I think the question is that typically this MAGA crowd does fold and get in line with Trump. We've seen that with tariffs. We've seen that with some of the things that have happened with immigration, with the 2 people who were killed in Minnesota. And so my question is, if the war continues in Iran and if it's a multi-week thing or a multi-month thing, or Trump ends up putting boots on the ground in Iran, do they come into the fold at some point to support Trump as they have in the past, or are they going to keep making noise? The other thing I will just say is that the Trump coalition from 2024 that brought him back to power of voters is a very fragile coalition of white working class, young men, Black men, Hispanics. And we've already seen that group of voters fray a little bit over the last, 8 months or so. And so it's not just these influencers that Trump is trying to hold on to and appeal to. It's really also the coalition of people who returned him to the White House in 2024. Can he motivate those people to go to the midterms? And I think that's an open question with his foreign policy moves.
Vivian, I want to go back to you because you and I actually first met covering the first Trump administration when that administration was focused on the Western Hemisphere. We met on a trip with Vice President Pence, and Vivian very kindly let me have the cool seat near the door of the helicopter with the door open. She's a lovely colleague. But
I'll never forgive you.
It's okay. I regret it, but I don't regret it.
Giving it to you is probably generous. Yeah.
But even on that trip, like during the first administration, we had this administration trying to kind of pivot to their backyard, right? We talked about these spheres of influence. And it's almost like the pivot to Asia that we've seen with successive administrations. The Trump administration keeps trying to pivot to the Western Hemisphere, and yet we're back in the Middle East again. And you've got some reporting and some insight into where this might be going next. And that sounds like they are seriously thinking about talking to Cuba, making inroads in Cuba, taking action in Cuba. What are we doing?
I mean, the president has made no secret of the fact, and I know that Nancy just alluded to it as well, where he told CNN's Dana Bash yesterday in a phone call that Cuba is next on his list and that talks are already underway to make that happen. About a week ago, he mused to journalists over a friendly takeover of Cuba. They've made no secret of this. They do believe that the time is right for a Cuba operation and that this would be really kind of critical at cementing the president's legacy if he could have taken care of Venezuela, toppled the clerical leadership of Iran, and then possibly remove the post-Castro communist regime of Cuba. They believe that this is a trio of accomplishments that would really kind of put him there above the legacies of presidents like Reagan or Jimmy Carter, or Richard Nixon on the foreign policy front. Now, of course, as my colleagues laid out, it has been very unpopular among his base. And this is one of the big struggles is that, on the one hand, he is essentially a lame duck president who is thinking about his legacy. And on the other hand, we are in a critical midterm election year, and he has to think about, keeping, bolstering those Republicans that right now are struggling in the lead up to this year's midterm elections because the economy has been struggling because of all these other factors as well. And so the president, is being told by his White House advisors that we need to get back to focusing on issues like affordability and the economy. But he's really found his footing, if you will, on these foreign policy issues, and he believes that they've been going extremely well, despite the fact that the war in Iran is very much in play, and there's really no telling how long it will last or how successful it will be. He's already eyeing this third target.
Jeff Mason, let's talk a bit about messaging, internal and external messaging. So picking up on what Vivian was just talking about there, who are the advisors to President Trump who are advising him to do this? And indeed, how does it complicate his messaging case going forward externally? Nancy laying out the degree to which this is landing flat with a lot of the president's base. As we see gas prices going up so significantly here over the last few days, talk about the complicated nature of messaging this foreign involvement to the U.S. electorate broadly.
Sure. Well, a couple things. First of all, if I'm ever on a trip with Vivian, I hope that she gives me the good seat.
There we go.
But second of all, both Vivian and Nancy laid it out really well. And Nancy's points about MAGA, at least part of MAGA, raising concerns about this creates a huge political risk, of course, for the president going into the midterms. That said, I think it's really important to note that it takes a lot for the president's base to part with him. The biggest political thorn in his side, at least with regard to his base over the last year, has been the Jeffrey Epstein files. And even with that, they are still supporting him. And I think the polls show largely still supporting him right now with the war in with the war in Iran, despite, of course, some vocal outliers who are public voices like Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, as Nancy referred to. In terms of messaging, David, to your question, part of it, what we've seen from President Trump is he likes to claim ownership of MAGA. He will say things along the lines of, I am MAGA. And so far, that's worked pretty well for him. If he says more or less, hey, just do this because this is what I want, in most cases, they fall in line. Outlier again with the Jeffrey Epstein files. I think it's TBD whether they completely fall in line with this war, and that, as Vivian was saying, will depend entirely on how successful it ends up being and how long it goes. And the third piece, to what extent it has long-term economic ramifications on gasoline prices, on inflation, in ways that will affect people's votes and pocketbooks as they're going into the polling booth in November.
First of all, Jeff, karma did come for me because Vivian then stuck me in the middle seat for the entire flight back, and it was a very long flight. So don't worry, I got my comeuppance. Nancy, before we go, though, I do want to ask, what does the president do if he loses the midterms? How does he handle that?
Well, what we're expecting and what his advisors are expecting is that Republicans will lose the House. That is what they privately think, and they think that they will very narrowly hold on to the Senate. And so, if that's the case, we're going to end up with divided government. There will be a ton of investigations into the Trump White House, cabinet members, corruption. Trump could be impeached again. And so, if he does lose the House, it's going to be a whole different last 2 years of his presidency, one that will be dominated by investigations, having to set up sort of war rooms and lawyers to deal with that. And that's really what we saw during the first Trump term as well. The last 2 years of his presidency were dominated by dealing with those issues. And that will be part of his legacy, just as he now views these nation-building foreign policies incursions as part of his legacy.
Nancy, thank you very much. That's Nancy Cook, our colleague here at Bloomberg. Her newest piece is MAGA is Split. Trump digs in on Iran war, divides loyalists. Jeff Mason is our White House correspondent, joining us here on this Saturday morning. Vivian Salama, who I understand cut her teeth at Bloomberg News back in the day as a Middle East correspondent. Got to note that. Now at The Atlantic, a staff writer there. Thanks to all of you for your time on this Saturday. Coming up, former Secretary of State Antony Blinken laying out 2 keys to ending the war with Iran. My wide-ranging interview with the former Secretary of State is coming up next.
And how it's going to impact the future of U.S. foreign policy. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the top stories. And the war in Iran showing no signs of slowing. We have President Donald Trump posting a warning on Truth Social this morning. He's saying the U.S. will consider striking areas and groups of people in the Iran conflict that were not yet considered for targeting until now. Now, the president's post, it comes in response to headlines out of Tehran that says Iran's president has informed Iranian armed forces not to attack or launch missiles at neighboring countries unless attacked from there. In a televised speech, he apologized to neighboring countries for being attacked by Iran. Now, meanwhile, Israel launched another wave of strikes on Tehran as the Islamic Republic targeted missiles at Israel. Countries in Europe and Asia, they've been moving to boost the region's defenses. President Donald Trump said he would travel to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware today to attend the dignified transfer ceremony for U.S. service members who were killed in the conflict. 6 U.S. troops were reported to have died. In other news, at least 6 people killed Friday in Michigan and Oklahoma. Powerful storms produced at least 1 tornado. Many homes reduced to rubble, the destruction leaving a trail of debris hanging from power lines. According to the National Storm Prediction Center, nearly 25 million Americans are facing severe weather risks. And in company news, Oracle has scrapped plans to expand a flagship artificial intelligence data center in Texas. Now, it comes after negotiations dragged on over financing and OpenAI's changing needs. The interesting thing here, David and Christina, is that it creates this opening for Meta to step in and consider leasing that space instead. But we'll see what happens.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. The result of what we're seeing in Iran is, of course, due to this administration's policy, but that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's successive administration, successive Middle East policies, complicated situation, complicated diplomatic situation. And to get some perspective on that, you spoke to a former Secretary of State who was in office not so long ago.
Yes, I spoke with former Secretary of State Antony Blinken this week, and it's funny, David Sanger of the New York Times did yeoman's work kind of categorizing or cataloging how many different rationales for this war we've gotten from the administration. I think he put a dozen in his article in the Times this morning. I started there with the former Secretary of State. I said, look, we've heard from the President, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, all these different rationales. I was just curious how he sees the motivations here, the rationales for this war. Let's take a listen. I'm curious at this point what your understanding is of the case this administration has made for the U.S. going to war against Iran.
Well, look, the case keeps shifting, but the first thing to say is this, from my perspective. Once our men and women in uniform are engaged in an operation or in a war, my first thought is for their safety and for their success, irrespective of what I think about how we got there or even where this is going. So that's primarily what I'm thinking of. But having said that, we've heard a number of shifting rationales. But I think it's important to take into account that we've got to be able to hold multiple truths in our head at the same time. Is it a good thing that this Ayatollah is gone? Yes. Terrible tyrant. Is it a good thing, potentially at least, that Iran's nuclear program is, I guess, re-obliterated, because apparently it was obliterated last June, but maybe not so much because they had to re-obliterate it. Or its missile program diminished, or its Navy sunk? Yes. But to do that and to take on the extraordinary risks that go with it without having made the case with the American people, with citing imminent threats that apparently didn't exist, I think that's problematic. And the chances of unintended consequences taking hold in any situation like this are very real, very serious for our partners and allies in the region, and for ourselves, and of course for the Iranian people. I think a big question that everyone has is, okay, have we done regime change in Iran or just Ayatollah change, which is the way it looks right now?
The Supreme Leader, who's been killed, of course, warned in the run-up to this that if there were U.S. strikes, the U.S. risked a wider regional war. How has what's played out over these last few days, how does that compare to what you expected would happen here? I imagine in your old jobs, there were planning meetings and war games in which you kind of try to figure out what might happen here. As we see this war widen, is that in keeping with what you expected when you heard the Supreme Leader warn of that?
Well, look, it's certainly something that should have been anticipated. And what's one of the striking features so far is that Iran has launched far more missiles and far more drones at the Arab countries in the Gulf and in the region than it has even at Israel, disproportionately so. And in part, that's because we have bases and a presence there, but they've gone beyond that. They've gone at infrastructure that these countries have, the oil infrastructure. They want to try to inflict so much pain that we can't sustain the effort. And that's something that should have been anticipated. And David, I think we're looking at a couple of things going forward in terms of where does this go and how does this end. And it seems to me that there are two critical factors to look at: markets and munitions. Markets. Where are the oil markets? Where's the stock market? Where's the bond market? I know President Trump is very attentive to those. And if they go in a southerly direction and stay that way, or in the case of oil, in a northerly direction, that's going to be possibly a limiting factor. Then munitions. There's really a race on to figure out who expends their munitions first and fastest. Do the Iranians put us in a position where we've used up a lot of interceptors to deal with defense, or even our offensive missiles to take out their launchers, or conversely, did they run out and we still have what we need? I don't know the numbers here. I'm not privy to that, but it is something we have to be very, very attentive to, because these things are not in infinite supply.
Do you see an off-ramp anywhere at this point?
I do, in the sense that, one, as I said, I think the off-ramp will be governed by this question of munitions and markets. Mm-hmm. And then what is that off-ramp? I think the president may simply declare victory. He'll say, got rid of the Ayatollah. We diminished or degraded or destroyed their nuclear program. Again, we did the same thing to the missile program. We did the same thing to the Navy. And as to the regime, well, over to the Iranian people. Good luck to them. Hope they succeed. And if they don't, it's their fault. If they do, we'll take the credit. How Iran responds to that remains to be seen. And for the regime, survival is success. Right now, the expectation seems to be, at least as has been reported, that the Ayatollah's son is his successor. He's very tied into the IRGC. And so you may have a situation where, much as we want, and everyone should want to see a change in that regime, we have, regime change without regime change.
Status quo.
Status quo. And even potentially, even worse, because it may simply ultimately reinforce the IRGC, the military, the specialized military. And part of the problem with these things is that it's very hard to produce regime change from outside. You can't bomb your way to it. We've had a lot of experience with that, and not such good experience over the last 20 years. It's even not so likely to come from the streets, even with the extraordinarily courageous Iranian people. It's more likely to come from kind of within the palace.
Is it too late for there to be a diplomatic solution, or to have those conversations at this point?
No, I think it's never too late for diplomacy. The question is there a good moment? Is this the right moment for it? I would hope so, because on one level, the Iranians have never been weaker, at least not in recent memory, militarily, politically at home, diplomatically abroad. And their proxies are for the most part gone or vastly diminished. So that's why I was hopeful before this action started that maybe they actually would get a renewed nuclear deal, because Iran had a very weak hand to play. So I think there is a possibility of doing that. Whatever the new regime is, or the continuation of the existing regime is ready to do that, wants to do that, to be determined. It also depends on what the Trump administration wants to do, and I imagine Israel is going to have a say in this as well. We've had other second and third order consequences here. At the very time when Russia is really reaching a weak point because of its dependence on oil to fuel its war economy, its revenues, the government's revenues are down almost 20%, in large part because the price of oil has gone down. It's having more trouble exploiting oil because of sanctions and restrictions that we put on technology. That's been a huge and growing factor. And the thing to do now, ideally, would be to squeeze the shadow fleet that they have that's going around the world, and that's the one thing that's able to keep them going. At the very time when that's possible, and that might force Putin to finally cut a deal on Ukraine, they get a lifeline, and the lifeline is the price of oil is going up, and the value of that shadow fleet oil is going up, and people will need it and want to buy it. The Europeans, in turn, having moved away from Russian gas, are now more dependent on the Middle East. And if that gets tied up, if the Straits of Hormuz remain problematic, that's going to put a lot of pressure on them.
I want to wrap up with where this leaves us, where this leaves the world. And Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada spoke recently, and he said this is just another example of what he's talked about before, this rupture in the global order. Yeah. That's happened on two counts here. There have been two failures, the first of which was the multilateral institutions that we've relied on weren't able to constrain Iran effectively. That's one. The second is you have the U.S. and Israel now going it together without the consent of the UN or other multilateral institutions. Do you agree with him as he talks about the way that hegemony, the global order, has changed?
Look, we're very much at an inflection point in the global order, in the rules-based order that we spent 80 years building up, and that was premised on one, I think, profound insight, and that was enlightened self-interest, the notion that the success and strength of others would be our own as well. And we were able to build a system that avoided other countries ganging up against us, as is usually the case when one country rises above the others. We had new markets for all the stuff we wanted to sell. We had new partners to deal with different conflicts, different problems. We had new allies to deter aggression, especially with NATO. And now that system is being put in the, for now at least, in the dustbin and being replaced with, there are different versions of this. Some people believe that the president's engaged in going back to a kind of spheres of influence world where the Russians do what they want in their part of the world, the Chinese do what they want, except maybe on the economic issues in their part, and we do what we want to do in our part, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. And then you've got these problematic areas that are dealt with by force. That's a profound thing, and that's what's happening now. But I think at the same time, and this is what's maybe most frustrating of all in the Middle East, is that there's also an extraordinary opportunity. If very big if, this does produce some kind of real change in Iran, then you have the prospect of a region that heads in a very different direction, that is integrated with its people, it's moving back and forth, its economy is integrated, greater success, greater prosperity for folks. But there remains one catch to that vision besides how Iran resolves, and that's the question of Israelis and Palestinians. The truly big vision right now would be to actually resolve that question, not to try to put it under the rug yet again. The bottom line is this. There are roughly 7 million Jews in Israel. There are about 2 million Arabs, 5 million Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza. No one is going anywhere, despite the efforts of some on both sides to make that happen. And so tell me how this ends. I don't see how this ends without some kind of genuine political accommodation that realizes the rights of Palestinians. This is the moment for that big vision, because that brings with it something incredibly powerful. Normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and then potentially other countries will follow suit, from Qatar to Indonesia. And then if the Iranian problem is diminished, and Iran really has to face a choice between being a pariah gadfly or mending its ways, I think that's the most likely way we're actually going to see real change. Unfortunately, tragically, given the trauma on all sides after October 7th, on the Israeli side and among Palestinians, it's awfully hard to get there. But that's where you need people of vision to try to move things in that direction. There is actually an opportunity to do that. I worry that that opportunity will not be seized, and we're going to just see a continuation among Israelis and Palestinians. And also, Iran is, again, likely, in this moment, if I had to bet, again, we're replacing one Ayatollah for another, and the nature of the regime in this moment doesn't seem likely to change. I hope I'm pleasantly surprised, and the Iranians get the leadership that they deserve, but the jury's very much out on that.
Last question is, what this war in Iran means for President Trump's other ambitions, be that Cuba, be that Greenland, continued project in Venezuela. How do you think about what this may or may not lead to?
Well, in some ways, Iran's the outlier, because these other areas that you just mentioned are all within what would be our so-called sphere of influence. And that's why I said, before, what we're seeing is at least is one of the shifts I think we're seeing is the president seems to see the world in terms of these spheres of influence, and anything within our sphere we should in one way or another control. And there's kind of a very 19th century view that actually controlling the territory is the most important thing. Never mind that there's absolutely no need to do that. I mean, in the case of Greenland, simply asking would have gotten the right answer in terms of putting more military forces there or striking deals on their raw materials. But that world, a spheres of influence world, where the big guys on the block, and it is guys in this view, get to do what they want in their area. That's the way things were for much of the latter part of the 19th century, but it didn't end well. We ultimately end up with World War I.
Spheres of influence. Very good interview.
Thank you so much.
Spent a lot of time with that guy. That was well done. If you want to hear more from that interview and from the guy sitting next to me, you can listen to the Big Take Daily Podcast. Listen, unsubscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We want to go now to Elise Labott is back with us. She, of course, is a global affairs journalist and the author of Cosmopolitics on Substack, and Stuart Livingston Wallace. He's Bloomberg News head of Middle East and North Africa coverage. Elise, I want to start with you. First of all, if anything stood out for you from David's interview with Secretary Blinken, and also, I know you've been wanting to talk about the messaging here from the U.S. and the rationale and evolving rationale for why the U.S. is there, what the U.S. is doing, and what the end goal is.
Well, when David was talking about how David Sanger and the Times kind of laid out almost, close to a dozen rationales for war, I think the rationales keep changing, because originally the U.S., Christina, didn't really, wasn't focused on regime change. They were focused on eliminating the kind of threat posed by Iran, whether it's, missiles, the nuclear threat.
Well, right. And the first messaging was to protect protesters. It was, you better not hurt the protesters. And we've come a long way from there.
Yeah, I think that was more about gaining leverage for an eventual negotiation on the nuclear front. I don't know if it was ever really, let's be honest, President Trump really isn't, forward leaning on human rights, democracy, things like that. I think that was more about leverage, but the U.S. was really focused on the threat posed by Iran. Yes, the Israelis were also, but you got to remember that this is part of a larger kind of post-October 7th campaign by Israel to reset the region. And so it weakened Iran, it weakened the proxies. The Israelis were really forward-leaning. They really started the whole June war. The U.S., in my opinion, has kind of been a supporting player in Israel's larger campaign. We've got the firepower, but I think this is really being led by the Israelis. Okay. And so when, originally the U.S. is like, we're going after the threat, the Israelis are clearly not. You had the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby, talking on the Hill. You had Rubio kind of leaning into the idea that, not that the objectives weren't overlapping, but that the Israeli military campaign was very different. Now, on David's excellent interview with Secretary Blinken, I think it leans into that. So Israel has really set the kind of geopolitical landscape here. But I really think there is an opportunity for President Trump to, in the aftermath of the war, kind of bring the region together on a forward-looking vision. But he's right. This isn't some Wizard of Oz, ding dong, the witch is dead moment where everybody kind of sings together and the region is all happy. You're still going to have to deal with the, larger problem of the Palestinian conflict. So eliminating that Iranian threat, definitely great. But there's a lot more to do to heal this region.
Stuart, I want to pull back a bit and ask you about how this is playing out beyond the region. We had Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, in Washington this week, meeting with the president and expressing his reservations or concerns about this becoming a forever war, this lasting longer than I think many European allies would want it to. How do you see the level of influence they have, so much as they have any, and what is that kind of what does that effort on their part, the part of other allies outside the region, to sort of exert influence on the U.S. look like at this moment? We've seen President Trump and the administration so outwardly disparaging of Europe in particular.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, and that's absolutely key here. I mean, I would imagine they don't have a great deal of influence, at least not relative to what you would normally expect between European partners and the U.S. administration. But where I do think you have to look very carefully, and this is something that was mentioned in your interview with Blinken, is the markets. That is something we know Trump cares about deeply. And at least part of the Iranian strategy here seems to be to turn the markets haywire. And you've seen that, yes, in commodities, notably in oil and gas, but also in lots of other refined products. You've seen disruptions to the cargo market, because remember, they've been targeting cargo ports. And we're sitting here on one of the world's great choke points for maritime trade. And maritime trade basically carries everything. It's 90% of global trade by volume, not necessarily by value, but certainly by volume. So if you knock out one of the choke points or you make it that much harder to get through, you're going to roil everything. And that's going to have this knock-on effect onto everything. And that is the one thing the US administration will pay attention to, is sinking markets. So that at least seems to be part of the response here. It's clearly not the only part of it, but it seems to be an increasingly important one. And you've seen, lots of leaders here come out talking specifically about the impact that it's having on the region economically and in terms of stability, but also the ripple effect that this has across the world, because you've got something like 20 to 25% of global seaborne oil that passes through Hormuz. But you've also got this enormous gas supply as well. And in the context of Russian gas being more or less knocked out, that's going to have a huge impact, not just on Europe, but also more importantly on Asia, because they're the biggest buyers of Middle East energy, really, Eurasia. So then you're going to start seeing potentially pressure applied on the US administration to try and find a diplomatic resolution to this from some of the Asian buyers as well. Yeah. So really what this is doing is spreading out, this urgency to try and find an off-ramp here. Quite what that off-ramp may be, hard to see.
And Elise, in that interview, and I refuse to give David Gura any more compliments about that interview because it was lovely, but we can't let him get too confident here at the table. But he does ask the secretary about the impact on Russia. And, the secretary says this would have been the time to force Putin to finally make a deal. And now they're getting a lifeline because the price of oil is going up. And Europe rotating away from Russian gas and LNG has become more dependent on the Middle East. Everything is connected in global politics. What is the impact of this conflict on what happens with Ukraine, with Russia, and with NATO, which we discussed a little bit, but I'd like your take as well.
Well, and we just saw reports that the Russians are providing the Iranians with intelligence to target the United States. So this actually gives, not only does it give a boost to Russia in terms of oil sales, and you saw that the president is kind of reducing or, relaxing some of these restrictions on the sale of Russian oil to India. There's talk that it may be also to some other countries. This definitely is a boon for Russia, not only in terms of, seeing the U.S. possibly in a weaker state if this war drags on, but also giving it some oil sales. And the fact that the administration has not been able or is unwilling to confront the Russians on this really speaks to the fact that, Putin doesn't really have an incentive now to solve the war in Ukraine. And listen, the Iranians are going to be, hit very hard by the U.S. and Israel over the next few days. But this is going to drag on a while, guys. And those oil markets and such are going to continue to be rattled. We don't know what this is going to unleash in the region. This Shia crescent that the Iranians have tried to rally the Shia across the region. You see a lot of those riots at the embassies are from the Shia all over. So there could be instability in these countries for a long time. The markets originally were a little bit, hesitant to move because they didn't know how long the war was going to drag on. But the longer this drags on, the more instability, the more uncertainty, and that definitely affects the markets.
And on the markets, we've got some sound from earlier this week on Bloomberg of Secretary Wright speaking about that. I'm going to play for you guys.
We need to get oil on the market in the short term. In the long term, supplies are abundant. There's no worries there. But as oil gets bid up a little bit because of those constraints coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, we're taking a short-term action to say all this floating Russian oil storage that's around southern Asia, it's China just backed up. China does not treat their suppliers well. So there's a bunch of floating barrels just sitting there. We've reached out to our friends in India and said, buy that oil, bring it into your refineries.
Apologies, obviously that was on ABC. I misspoke there. But Stuart, you looked like you wanted to say something when I was asking about the Russia impact. So have at it. And then your reaction to what the Energy Secretary was saying there.
Oh, well, no, I think you've got a very comprehensive answer. I suppose there's the issue of munitions as well. This is something we've been looking at very carefully because of the scale of what's being fired. And there is some concern about whether you can produce it and replace it fast enough, and that's going to have an impact on every theatre where you have a war zone. But otherwise, I thought you got a very full answer. But sorry, I now forget the rest of your question.
No, I just was wondering if anything from the Energy Secretary about him talking about the impact on oil markets stood out to you. He says, but as oil gets bid up a little bit because of constraints in the Strait of Hormuz, we're taking a short-term action to, say all this Russian oil storage around southern Asia. He's basically talking about how the U.S. is going to respond to this. And I guess the other question is, do we think the U.S. releases stock from the reserve, which we were talking to Mike McKee about earlier?
Right. I suppose a couple of things on that is that it's not that simple. And by that, I mean, oil is not necessarily a homogeneous product. There are lots of different grades, and every refinery on the planet is able to handle only a certain number of grades. So they're not interchangeable necessarily. And if you don't have the right grades, then a certain number of refineries are not going to be able to process it. So that's number one. Number two, it's not a question of just turning on and turning off a spigot, particularly when it comes to oil fields. They are all very different, but you can't just switch them on and off. Once you shut it off, it's going to take a while to get back up. So exactly the same with an aluminium plant, exactly the same with a gas plant. These are very, very complex bits of kit, and you can't just switch them on and off. So the ripple effect, if you have to shut it down now, potentially goes on for weeks or even months, depending on how long you've shut it down for and the particular type of plant that you're talking about. So that's sort of the response there. In terms of the strategic petroleum reserves, there is a certain amount of oil there, but remember that, they were already reduced and they have not been filled up since. So it's really a little bit uncertain at the moment how long they can last. As I say, there is a vast amount there, but again, how long will this conflict go on for? How long will the supply disruption go on for? And again, back to what I said at the beginning, not all oil is equal. And is the right kind of oil in there needed for all the refineries that are currently not getting their supplies from the Middle East?
Stuart Livingston-Wallace there, who heads up our Middle East and North Africa coverage, Elise Labott, who writes the Cosmopolitics Substack. Thank you both for joining us here on this Saturday and for your response to that interview that I conducted a little bit earlier this week. And I should say we're seeing a hothead, as we call it, crossing the Bloomberg terminal right now, an urgent headline that Kuwait is confirming cuts in oil production and refining throughput. And just want to put that in the context of what we were just talking about, Christina, which is the oil market broadly adjusting and trying to figure out the path forward here amidst so much uncertainty. We were talking about the Strait of Hormuz just a few minutes ago, how traffic has diminished to basically nothing in that strait right now. And we're seeing, yes, the U.S., but other governments trying to plot a path forward here to figure out what to do in light of the fact that it does seem like many shipping companies very reluctant to send vessels through that strait in light of the risks that it faces right now, even with the prospect of there being some insurance provided by the U.S. government.
Right, and we've been talking about how it's also a matter of confidence as well. It's the strait is not physically blocked, but can you insure it? Can you send it? And is anybody willing to go? And they're just not willing to take that risk. And that's a knock-on effect. There's a mental effect as well as a physical effect of these strikes, and it's going to dial back the risk factor for all these producers, and it's going to impact the market.
I'm going to continue following that over the course of this morning. And with the war intensifying overseas, President Trump ousted Christina Noem from the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to have the latest on that turmoil as you, I hope, take us with you wherever you go on this Saturday on Bloomberg Television, radio, and streaming on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app.
Welcome back. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I jumped on you, and then I knocked your pen out of your hand. Go ahead.
It's been a couple mornings. We're here for you because it's morning, it's early, and it's the weekend. Welcome back to Bloomberg this weekend.
And only our second week. It feels like it's been a longer crucible that we've been in all of this.
We've been up quite a bit this weekend and the last weekend, making sure you have all the news. And on that note, we want to go to Kevin Whitelaw, who is the managing editor of America's Weekends, to talk about some of the other news happening around this administration.
A lot happening on Capitol Hill, which we've been remiss in talking about. But of course, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Christina Noem dismissed by the president earlier this week. Kevin here with us to talk about that and her presumptive successor, Mark Wayne Mullin, the senator from Oklahoma. Kevin, great to see you, as you bear with us, as everyone else does, and my clumsiness here on this Saturday morning.
Well, I'm going to start. Kevin, who is currently in charge of DHS?
Well, Christina Noem is still in charge,
okay.
Nominally, at the very least. Trump said that she was going to leave at the end of the month, and I guess that was we sort of saw that play out because Trump announced the change, and then she went on stage at an event in Nashville and spoke as if she hadn't just been fired from the job. But this obviously was sort of weeks, if not months, in coming. There had been growing frustration with her sort of performance in that role. She'd been sidelined, really, in some ways, from some of the immigration enforcement decision making already. But it was interesting to sort of watch. It could have been a lot of different things that pushed her over the edge. As far as Trump was concerned, it could have been the performance of immigration enforcement in Minnesota, where we obviously saw some fatalities. It could have been a number of other moments in whether it was her personal life and allegations of a potential affair with an aide. But it actually seems that it was actually advertising spending that she contradicted the president by saying he'd approved the spending for. That was really about her image. And that seemed to be the moment that actually did her in.
Kevin, I'm curious about where we go from here directionally. And you bring up that ad campaign, and Bloomberg has done such fine work just on how all of that came together, the enormous spending. Again, what you're talking about there, the kind of how she and the president were on different pages about that and how that came out in that hearing. When you think about what happens in terms of departmental trajectory as Christina Noem steps aside and presumably Mark Wayne Mullin comes in, what changes as a result of that? How do you see this department kind of changing tack in the next few weeks?
Well, I'm guessing what you're probably going to see is, obviously, first of all, the senator would have to be confirmed in the role, so we'll have to see just how quickly that actually happens. But given the Senate would confirm him, and they're normally reasonably deferential to their own when they get picked for these roles, so that may be a reasonably smooth process. But once he's in that role, we'll have to see. He may well take a lower profile approach than Christina Noem at first, in part just to begin to establish a bit of a difference from her, and to try to avoid some of the pitfalls that she fell into. But it was interesting. The senator did speak with the media really quite freely and openly right after he was named. So he was pretty accessible right away, which is actually a little unusual for when nominees get named, but it was instructive. He apparently learned about 30 seconds before the rest of the world did that he was going to be the next Secretary of Homeland Security.
It was a wild moment. He said he was super excited. I think that's a quote about the opportunity. And it was astonishing to see that kind of like grab him in the hallway of the Capitol moment, Christina, in which he acknowledged the fact that he hadn't talked to Noem, hadn't talked, I don't think, to his family about it beforehand, really felt palpably fresh for Senator Markwayne Mullin.
This is something that was much more common for those of us who covered the first administration, going up to officials with your phone in the hallway and saying either you have a job, you don't have a job, would you like to comment?
And they're saying, can I see your phone?
Literally, like, can I see your phone? But I also want to ask you, I mean, we've focused so much this week on what's happening overseas, but President Trump did say to Time magazine that he guesses Americans should expect retaliatory attacks at home. That's not exactly comforting, and this comes at a time when, as we just discussed, there is transition going on at DHS. What kind of state is that organization, that agency in? Is it able to respond to these possible attacks, possible just terrorism threats, when it is so focused on other things, including immigration?
Look, I think that's been a concern for DHS, also for the Justice Department and the FBI. I mean, there's been so many resources thrown at the immigration area that it has been taking agents and expertise and time and energy away from many other different areas. And then don't forget, DHS is still in a shutdown state. So we're still in a standoff over the spending bills, and everyone there is operating without paychecks. And so as we, they've missed a paycheck, they're going to miss the next one at this point. We haven't seen any movement. It's not like Noem's departure is really changing the contours of that debate. Neither side has really moved at all, and neither side's really feeling that much pressure to move. Even as you say, there was this remark from Trump that seemed almost offhand about the possibility of, there may be something by way of an attack. I think that should be a very serious concern, but realistically, it obviously may still take some time for Iran and its proxies to figure out ways to project that kind of attack.
Kevin, great to speak with you. I suspect we're going to be talking with you often these weekends, and I promise to get my act together the next time we do it. It won't be as ad hoc at the top. But Kevin Whitelaw heads up our America's Weekend coverage for us out of our Washington,
Kevin, thank you so much. And to be honest with you, he said, don't forget DHS is still in a shutdown. I had kind of forgotten DHS is still in a shutdown.
That's right. The partial shutdown continues. And very curious, just as we talk to lawmakers on this show, how they think about that change in leadership maybe affecting that shutdown that's been in place. I mean, that hearing that took place, those two hearings, I should say, in the House and the Senate with Christina Noem this week really showcased a new kind or a different kind of Republican politics to some degree, pushing back against her leadership and what's happened with that agency.
And this is an opportunity for Republicans who don't want to go against the president to maybe steer the agency a little bit to where they would like it to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So much more to come here on Bloomberg this week, and we are coming up on the 9 o'clock hour here in New York. We're going to have a live report from Israel. Our colleague Dan Williams is going to join us as the Iran war enters its second week and as Bloomberg This Weekend continues on Bloomberg Television, radio, and streaming online.
Stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura and Lisa Mateo.
Yes, we are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. It is Saturday, March the 7th. Here are the stories that we're following on this Saturday morning.
Fresh strikes underway against Iran, and Iran hits back. President Trump making a new demand, unconditional surrender.
In Iran, we're doing very well. Somebody said, how would you score it from 0 to 10? I said I'd give it a 12 to a 15.
But this morning, Iran's president says his country will never surrender as the White House pushes back on questions about U.S. munitions.
We have more than enough ammunitions, weapons, stockpiles to achieve the objectives of Operation Epic Fury and beyond.
Americans bracing for a big jump in oil and gas prices, up 9 cents overnight.
The price at the pump matters a lot in terms of sentiment, in terms of crowding out other spending. And so I'm just watching prices at the pump.
As the war opens up new fronts, new uncertainties, and new hardships for people on the ground.
Good to have you with us here across our platforms on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, streaming online at Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. And this morning, we're really paying close attention to what the president telegraphed in a post on social media in the early morning hours. He's in Florida right now, presiding over a summit that's taking place there with Latin American leaders. He's making his way to Delaware on the heels of that for a dignified transfer of those 6 troops who've died in the Iran war thus far, then heading back to Florida. But let me read, Christina, a little bit from that post if I can. He said, today, Iran will be hit very hard under serious consideration for complete destruction and certain death because of Iran's bad behavior are areas and groups of people that were not considered for targeting up until this moment in time. He closes that post by saying, thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So ratcheting up things here quite a bit, Christina.
Exactly. We're going to check in with Lisa Mateo, the latest headlines, and then we'll come back to a live report from Elise. Lisa, what have you got?
All right, so all of this as the war with Iran enters its second week. Ahead of the president's warning, a lot of action going on. We have Israel launching another wave of strikes on Tehran and Iran-targeted missiles at Israel. Saudi Arabia has stepped up direct engagement with Iran to try and prevent the conflict from worsening. The Saudi press agency said the country has intercepted drones heading toward an oil field, as well as 2 ballistic missiles launched toward Prince Sultan Air Base. Now, meanwhile, Russia reportedly providing Iran with the locations of American troops in the region. But White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said it wasn't an issue because the U.S. was still winning the war.
But of course, as the president has maintained, we have more than enough ammunitions, weapons, stockpiles to achieve the objectives of Operation Epic Fury and beyond. We've taken out nearly 30 of their ships. Their Navy has been deemed combat ineffective. 90% reduction in ballistic missile retaliatory strikes against the United States and our Gulf Arab and partners in the region. So, of course, we are achieving the military objectives of this operation.
And Washington also pushing back on worries around surging energy costs. U.S. prices at the pump rose Friday to the highest since September 2024. Brent crude settled at over $92 a barrel. Now, oil traders warning the prices could reach $100 a barrel within days, with shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz all but halted. And now this news, Kuwait, which is OPEC's 5th biggest producer, said it's reduced oil and refinery production following the slowdown in the shipping traffic through Hormuz. Now, meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tells Fox the U.S. could further ease sanctions on Russian oil to increase supply. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett explained the plan to Bloomberg.
The sanction waiver that Secretary Bessent came out with is just one of many, many tools that we have ready. We've got a whole flowchart of tools to use depending on this or that, and we're ready to move them as soon as we have to. But we're also very optimistic that we're going to be able to get this near-term problem resolved relatively quickly.
And finally to the airports now, where Dubai's Emirates plans to resume operations after flights were temporarily suspended following disruptions caused by another round of interceptions. Dubai International Airport also temporarily suspended operations. Retaliatory strikes from Iran led to the UAE to shut its airspace, also caused some minor structural damage to the hub in Dubai as well. David and Christina.
Lisa, thanks so much. Lisa Mateo there with the headlines. As we continue to follow a very busy morning in the Middle East.
That's right. We're going to go now to Dan Williams, who is our Jerusalem reporter. Dan, we've talked a lot about what the situation is going on right now, but I also want to ask you, for average everyday people, what is the level of disruption at this time? You mentioned you've been in and out of shelters in the last days and weeks. Throughout the region, we talked to Lisa. We've heard about travel disruptions, just disruptions of the economies. How are people feeling about how this is going to impact them, not just their security, but their lives for the weeks and hopefully not, but possibly months to come?
Indeed. Well, within Iran, obviously, it's total chaos. They're facing the decapitation of a regime that's controlled or governed, ruled their lives for almost half a century. Bombs falling intensively, even by the accounts of the Americans and Israelis. This is a war on an unprecedented scale, an aerial campaign for now. So the Iranian situation would be the most dire in the region. In Gulf Arab countries that have found themselves in the line of fire, a very unfamiliar disruption. They have had, to a degree, warning systems, go to shelter orders that have helped them escape high casualties so far. But nonetheless, major disruptions for countries that have really assumed that they could continue with a degree of comfort, security, gilded existence based on the stability of financial markets, energy exports, the aviation hub that is Dubai Airport, etc. In Israel, the situation is rather different. Israelis are really accustomed to this reality going back decades, but certainly the last 2.5 years of multi-front war. It began with Gaza on October 7th, 2023, quickly spread to some 7 fronts, including Iran previously. So Israelis are weathered to these conditions. They understand what it means to have go to shelter orders. Their system of detection is actually sophisticated enough to home in on the specific areas that are under threat of being hit by those missiles. That spares other areas of the country unnecessary disruption. They can continue more or less with regular lives. Nonetheless, for the last week, schools have been closed, businesses have been closed, people have been discouraged from assembling in public. And Ben Gurion Airport, Israel's main gateway to the world, has been shut. However, on Thursday, that airport began cautiously taking in incoming flights for returning Israelis who had been stranded abroad. And tomorrow, Sunday, they say they will resume some outgoing flights. And indeed, there's some talk potentially of offices resuming business as usual, and even children going back to schools, albeit under precautionary conditions. So Israel inching back toward normalcy, while many in the Gulf are experiencing themselves really in the middle of this storm that they didn't anticipate and whose future they can't really predict.
Dan, it's been hugely valuable to talk to you about Israel's strategy in this war. And of course, we've seen some incursions, some attacks on Lebanon. And I want to play a bit of sound here before I ask you a question. That's from Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz. Let's take a listen to what he had to say recently about Lebanon.
And the government of Lebanon will pay a heavy price. If Nasrallah destroyed Lebanon, then Naim Qassem will also ruin it in this way.
Talking about the head of Hezbollah ruining Lebanon in a similar fashion, I'm curious, as we see Israel kind of going into Lebanon, concern or interest in Israel's kind of desire here to expand territory therein, how do you see the strategy vis-a-vis that country?
Well, that is the second front of this war for Israel. It's fighting in equal volume, both on the Lebanese and the Iranian fronts, to judge by official statements. Certainly very extensive dispossession of Lebanese who've been dispossessed quite a few times during the last 2.5 years of fighting. Israel effectively ordered out the entirety of southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River. That's about 1/10 of the country's land space. Something like a 10th or 20% of the population have heeded it so far. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who fled northward for fear of what looks like a growing Israeli ground maneuver. Following a number of airstrikes, the Israelis appear set on moving ground forces into southern Lebanon. And they're describing this as a necessary measure in order to finish off Hezbollah. But they're also saying, and as noted in those comments that you aired just now, that the Lebanese government actually undertook to do this last year in the summer. Lebanese government undertaking a resolution issued from Beirut to disarm Hezbollah, which is part of the Lebanese fabric after all, hopefully consensually, hopefully without any kind of bloody encounters. That has not happened so far. The Israelis are saying they have no territorial claims on Lebanon, but in the absence of internal action to remove the threat they see from what is effectively the cat's paw for Iran in Lebanon, a neighboring country, they will do the job themselves. So we're seeing a growing presence potentially mounting to a full-scale invasion of Lebanon. That hasn't happened yet, but it's not being ruled out by the Israelis, and it's certainly something that's being anticipated within Lebanon.
All right, Dan Williams, our Jerusalem reporter, thank you so much for your time this morning. We want to turn now to Victoria Coates. She's the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump and Vice President. We also have Jen Gavito. She's a senior advisor at the Cohen Group, and she was the acting presidential deputy assistant secretary for Near East Affairs for President Biden. Thank you both so much for being with us. Victoria, I want to start with you because I'm wondering, as you heard and listened or read, whichever your preferred method of communication was this morning, that Truth Social tweet from President Trump this morning telegraphing to Iran that incoming fire, incoming fury is heading their way. What is your reaction to both the language itself and to that kind of strategy, saying openly, this is what we're going to do, we're going to hit? What is the president trying to do with that messaging?
Well, I think the president justifiably has a great deal of confidence as we enter the second week of this war against Iran, I think we've been enormously successful in degrading their ability to fire off these ballistic missiles. Obviously, they can still do it. We need to be mindful of that and of the drones. But our ability and that of our allies to intercept them has been pretty seamless. And I think he's also saying that with that kind of air superiority that we have demonstrated, we can now use non-stealth aircraft to bomb Iran. So the tempo of the bombing will pick up. And so his message all along has been, if you lay down your arms, if you sue for amnesty, you will be treated with respect. You will be part of the rebuilding of Iran. But if you don't, we're going to use overwhelming force. I think that was the message this morning.
Gavito, I want to turn to you on this point. We've talked a lot over the course of the morning about the various rationales that we've heard from the president and from members of his administration as well. It was only yesterday we saw that post about unconditional surrender, and now we see this post from the president today. Do you have a clearer sense on this Saturday morning of what the president's objectives here are? And what does that message from the president on Truth Social today tell you about his tack, about his strategy going forward?
Thanks for having me. I think there is still a lot of mixed messaging coming out of this administration about what the objectives are. I think Victoria is absolutely right that if you frame things in an operational sense, then the very positive messaging about what's been achieved makes sense. But there continue, including yesterday with the president's Truth Social post as well, been suggestions that unconditional surrender, regime change actually remains on the table as an objective. And that is much different than the operational successes that we've seen, something that would, I think, draw the United States and Israel into a much longer term open-ended conflict with less quantifiable results, fewer metrics to measure success by. And so when I see these posts over the course of the last 24 hours, what it says to me is the administration has not yet settled on what exactly success is defined by.
Victoria, I'm wondering, we've had a lot of talk about how the duration of this, how long it could go, whether or not Iran, one of the things that was in the negotiations to begin with was the supply of intermediate and short-range missiles, and that was never really something Iran was willing to go on the table with. But it is still unclear to a lot of analysts how many of those Iran has, how long they can last in this conflict. Iran is now saying, we're in it for the long haul. The U.S. is saying we are stocked up, we're ready to go. Do we have any idea what kind of capacity Iran has to continue fighting back at this tempo? And do we know, what is your assessment of their nuclear program following those strikes from the U.S. last summer, after which the president said their program has been destroyed? Do we know if that's true and if they were able to rebuild before this recent round of attacks?
Well, I think we're learning a great deal more about their supplies of missiles, and we figured out that they've kept them in these so-called underground missile cities, which once you identify them are fairly easy to neutralize, and then you can just watch them. If they try to bring anything out, you can hit it. So I think with the missiles, we're pretty well underway toward neutralizing that threat, and that was one of the key metrics the president laid out at the beginning of the conflict, is that neutralizing those missiles and destroying their ability to rebuild them was critical. In terms of the nuclear program, that's more of an open-ended question. I think we did see an increasing activity around Fordow, around Pickaxe Mountain. That's one of the things that I think got everyone's concerns up, that they were moving towards weaponization of that nuclear program. We know there are 800 pounds of enriched uranium. Some say 60%, some say closer to 80%. But either way, you can make a weapon out of that material. And that is unaccounted for. Apparently, the Iranians told Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner they weren't willing to relinquish that. Again, that's something else that motivated this attack. So we have obviously the capacity, the heavy bombers to take care of those facilities. I think that, that will be the next phase of this action, will be to make sure that that is truly destroyed.
Victoria, let me ask you a question that's a variation of one I asked the former Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, this week, and that is, when you were in the administration and gaming out what might happen if there were to be this kind of conflagration in Iran, what did it look like as it spread regionally, and does it compare closely to what we're seeing right now? In other words, is the reaction commensurate with what you and your colleagues would have expected back in the first term?
Well, our approach was a little bit different in the first term because we were trying to manage this situation through the maximum pressure campaign, through the really devastating economic sanctions, which I think, had they been given a little bit more time, were pretty close to pushing Iran to the brink. And certainly the economic distress you saw in Iran around Christmas, which motivated those popular demonstrations. I mean, that weakness still endures. It's now worse. They can't fix that. And so I'm a little bit less concerned about a broader regional war. Iran's experience with broader regional wars has not been positive, primarily the Iran-Iraq war. And since the 1980s, they've tended to rely on their regional proxies to attack rather than directly engaging in a regional war. So my guess is that's what they're trying to do now with Hezbollah. Interestingly, Hamas has been essentially silent in Gaza, perhaps speaking to the fact that they're pretty much in disarray. Same for the Houthis. So that's kind of an interesting development as well.
And Jen, we've got about 30 seconds before we go, but I'm wondering if you see a diplomatic off-ramp here and how you think the administration might be able to drive down it.
Sure. I think for all the reasons Victoria just laid out, there is plenty of operational success that's been achieved and will continue to be achieved through this campaign, particularly in limiting Iran's ability to project power outside of its own borders, which was one of the early objectives that was suggested. So, I think there's a scenario by which you claim success in those areas. You acknowledge that wisdom and knowledge cannot be eliminated quite as easily, and you still have a very ideological regime in place that will likely continue to be in place. So, this may not be the only long-term solution, but I think that there could be an off-ramp by which the administration, Israel, claims success in the weeks ahead. Again, if you continue to talk about regime change, that changes that calculus.
All right, thank you so much. Jen Gavito, she's Senior Advisor at the Cohen Group, and of course, former Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs for the State Department. Victoria Coates, former National Deputy Secretary Advisor to President Trump and Vice President Pence, long titles, but very important
That's
ones.
exactly right. Well, coming up here on Bloomberg This Weekend, we're going to continue digging into that headline which just crossed the Bloomberg that Kuwait, OPEC's fifth largest producer, confirming it's cutting oil and refinery production as traffic slows through the Strait of Hormuz. More on that to come here on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the stories. We want to first bring you these live pictures that are coming out of Doral, Florida. This is President Trump as he sits there and shakes hands with different leaders in the area. This is the Shield of America Summit. For those of you listening to us right now, that's President Trump's initiative for security against narcotics trafficking in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, it comes after Donald Trump just ousted Homeland Security Secretary Christina Noem from the role, announcing that she would be replaced and become special envoy for the Shield of America. So this will continue right now. Now, meanwhile, this coming just after President Trump being very active on social media. Yeah, posting this, he's saying that the U.S. will consider striking areas and groups of people in the Iran conflict that were not yet considered for targeting until now. Now, that post, it comes in response to headlines out of Tehran that say Iran's president has informed Iranian armed forces not to attack or launch missiles at neighboring countries unless attacked from there. It was a televised speech, and he apologized to neighboring countries for being attacked by Iran. Now, meanwhile, we have Israel launching another wave of strikes on Tehran. The Islamic Republic targeted missiles at Israel. Countries in Europe and Asia also moving to boost the region's defenses. The conflict in the Middle East, it's left more than 1,300 people dead in Iran so far. Dozens of others have been killed elsewhere in the region in retaliatory strikes. Now, in other news, at least 6 people killed Friday in Michigan and Oklahoma. Powerful storms produced at least one tornado. Many homes reduced to rubble, the destruction leaving a trail of debris hanging from power lines. According to the National Storm Prediction Center, nearly 25 million Americans were facing severe weather risks. And the battle over between Novo Nordisk and Hims & Hers Health. Sources telling Bloomberg Novo plans to sell its weight loss drugs on Hims & Hers Health's platform. Now, a partnership could be announced as soon as Monday. The two companies have a similar agreement last year, but Novo scrapped it after Hims refused to stop marketing and selling copycat medications. David and Christina, shares of Hims & Hers, they surged 40% in after-hours trading on this news. So we'll see where it goes from here.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Welcome back. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. U.S. stocks saw their worst week in months, driven down by fast-rising oil prices and a disappointing jobs report. The Dow dropping 3% on the week, the S&P 500 down 2%, and the Nasdaq off 1.25%.
And meanwhile, oil. And I keep hearing Tom Keene, who was here last week, talking about the prospects for $100 a barrel oil. We are getting incredibly close to that. We saw oil jump some 36% this week. Some analysts predicting what Tom forecasted last week, that $100 a barrel within just days. For more on the markets, we are joined now by Michael McKee, once again, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, who's had a busy week talking with a lot of Fed policymakers. And Mike, that's where I want to start. One of the policymakers with whom you spoke was Tom Barker of the Richmond Fed. You asked him about oil prices. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about how this might affect the U.S. economy going forward.
Don't have any sense on how long it's going to take or what the implications are going to be. Obviously, you watch oil prices. While the U.S. is no longer a net importer, it's still the case that the price at the pump matters a lot in terms of sentiment, in terms of crowding out other spending. And so I'm just watching prices at the pump. They've jumped up over the last week. You can see that when you drive around. But of course, no one knows whether this is going to be short-term or long-term, and so we'll just see where it goes.
We'll see where it goes. Michael McKee, we've been talking about that in the geopolitical context. A lot of folks watching this war unfold unsure of that. You have economic policymakers who are very much in the same boat, kind of wondering with no real information about how long this is likely to drag on. How much of a difference does it mean the longer it does?
Well, the longer it does, the worse the impacts are going to be. Again, to go back to what I said earlier, it's probably not going to be a recession, but you're going to see maybe people pulling back on spending. There's a kind of rule of thumb that for every dollar price of oil goes up by the barrel, it's about 2 cents for a gallon of gasoline. But if it drags on, that drifts up to 4 cents. So it's definitely already noticeable for Americans. And the question is, are they going to start pulling back on other expenditures because they have to put that money into their gas tank? And that's what the Fed doesn't know. Now, the Fed also knows that lowering interest rates with gasoline prices going up isn't going to bring them down. And we learned a lesson in the 70s that just leads you to inflation. So they're not going to react to this. What they'll watch for is that knock-on effect doesn't get into other parts of the economy.
I mean, my first question is, do you also have Tom Keene in your head? And is this something that I will soon have? I'm new to Bloomberg. I didn't know if this is a rite of passage. We'll circle back to that. But I do also want to ask you about Friday's jobs report. Obviously, it came in a lot lower than expected, triggering broad market sell-offs. How are these two things related, and what does that mean for the overall health of the economy?
Well, they're really more related in a political sense, and it's tough for the president because, of course, gasoline prices are very bad for the Republicans in the midterm elections, and the fact that people are not getting jobs is also very bad.
Right, we heard the administration blaming cold weather and a couple other factors.
Yeah, it really wasn't cold weather. There were some adjustments statistically, but the number of people who couldn't work because of the weather was not out of line with what you usually see in February. It was just basically a weak report. Now, for the Fed, it's tough because it puts them on both sides of their mandate. They've got a weakening job market, which means they should maybe think about cutting interest rates, but they've got inflation going up, which means they should probably think about holding, if not raising rates. So they're kind of stuck. And I go back to what Tom Barker was talking about right now. The best thing for them to do is just sit and watch what's going on.
Talked to Tom Barker, you talked to Austin Goolsbee, the Chicago Fed, and this is something that you and he had a little colloquy about, the way that this is complicating the Fed's calculus and thinking going forward when it comes to inflation. Let's take a listen to what President Goolsbee had to say.
I remain hopeful / expecting that conditions will improve, that we'll start to see some progress on inflation, head us back to 2%, and by the end of this year, that we would be in a situation that we could commence our march back down to something like the settling point.
Mike, give us a fuller sense of what President Goolsbee and others are thinking. I know there's a school of thought here that you have this dramatic incident, this war in the Middle East, but with big events like this in the past, there's been some inclination on policymakers' parts that they can look through it. They can look through a big event like this, particularly in the context of inflation. What did he say about that and sort of how he's thinking about that dual mandate in light of what's happened here over the last week?
Well, everybody says they should look through it, all members of the Fed, because they know that energy prices go up and stay up temporarily and then come back down. And by the time the monetary policy move you make hits the markets, it's already going to be it's going to be too late. So for them, it's a question of sitting tight or when can they get back on the idea of cutting rates? Now, certainly the Fed's divided, and there's a group of members of the Open Market Committee who don't want to cut rates any further, absent a war. But for the majority, it's still a feeling that they're a little bit above neutral and that they could come down a little more. And it's a question of what are the data going to be telling them? What kind of permission do they have to move forward? And while there's all this uncertainty about prices and jobs, they can't move forward.
All right, you were a very busy man. You also spoke with Beth Hemmick at Hughes, the Fed Reserve at Cleveland. And speaking of monetary policy, you asked her kind of about the ultimate victor in the battle of the Kevins, and that's Kevin Warsh, and what role that he's going to play in making these decisions. Let's take a listen.
Whoever walks into that role, the chair seat is a particularly influential seat. They historically have tried to bring the committee together, get a perspective on where people are, and I have every confidence that Kevin, if he assumes the job, is going to do his absolute best for the American public, like all the rest of the 18 of us do around that table.
So with a divided Fed, will that person be the ultimate arbiter of how this decision is made?
Well, that would be the case if it were still Jay Powell. The issue is that the president is expecting Kevin Warsh to come in and immediately lower interest rates, and one man can't do that. There are 19 people on the committee. The chair's power is basically the power to persuade. And that was kind of the impetus of my question to Beth was, how soon will he be able to be persuasive? Because he's new, he's coming in, people know him, but he hasn't been in the chair where your job is try to gather all the sheep together and get a consensus on what's going on. And so everybody I talked to, including Beth Hemmick, said that they think he's going to be able to do that he's got the kind of personality and the experience at the Fed to do that, but they don't know exactly when that's going to be. And in a kind of funny way, the war helps Warsh out in that we're saying now these people can't really move until the data change. So he can come in and he can tell the president, well, I'm sorry we couldn't cut rates because
our hands are tied.
Because our hands are tied,
You spoke to these three officials on the eve of the blackout period. We're not going to hear from them anymore until the next Fed meeting.
A lot of people are happy about that.
There you go. Until the next meeting, which is in about 10 days' time. Get us up to speed on sort of what's going to be added to that panoply of data in the days to come. So we got this jobs report, and we've drilled into that a little bit here. But as they kind of look at a picture of this economy, and I should say the jobs report, obviously data that was before the war began. I'm curious of what they'll be looking for and what's going to determine the tack that they take going into that meeting on the 17th and 18th.
Well, all of the data they're going to get basically was before the war began. But what we're going to see is another CPI, another PPI, and another PCE. And the PCE is the inflation index that the Fed uses, that the Fed targets. And CPI is probably going to come in reasonably low as it did last time because there are some distortions in it left over from the government shutdown. PPI last time came in high, and it came in high on goods because of the tariffs. The question is, do we get to the end of that process? Are we going to start to see that level out because tariffs aren't going up anymore? And then the PCE is affected by both of those, and it's been hot. And the people who are nerdy enough to go in and put all this stuff together in advance are thinking we're going to see a strong PCE. So they're going to be in a position where they can't do anything about rates, and there's going to be a nervousness about inflation. So they'll sit tight. What'll be interesting to see is who projects what in terms of the dot plot. They forecast in December that there would be one move this year. Do they take that out of any consideration? Do they add another one in? Where are they on that? And then what are their forecasts for inflation going forward? And all the people we talked to basically haven't changed their forecasts much. They think that second half of this year, prices are going to price increases will start to slow, and inflation will start to slow. But they all admit now we don't know because we don't know how long the war is going to go on.
Can I ask you, just going back to the jobs report, what was most worrisome to you and others therein? So 92,000 jobs lost. Healthcare had kind of been buffeting the jobs market for so long. I saw in one note, I think it was some high-frequency economics commentary, that this is a jobs report that will get the Fed's attention. What beneath the headline numbers was most startling or is more likely to get the Fed's attention?
I think the biggest thing, there was little job creation in any category. There was no breadth of job creation.
Even healthcare, right?
Healthcare was affected by a strike, 31,000 nurses off the job on the West Coast. But even if you added them back in.
1 second.
I'm so sorry. The president is speaking right now in Doral, Florida. We're going to go to that right now.
We're doing something. I built
the military and rebuilt it and made it really strong. And my first administration, along with a lot of other things we did, we had a great first term. And now we're using it. Unfortunately, we have to. But you're seeing how great it is. There's no military like it on earth, not even close. And we're doing very well in Iran. You see the result. And it's been amazing. We've knocked out 42 Navy ships, some of them very large, in 3 days. That was the end of the Navy. We knocked out their Air Force. We knocked out their communications, and all telecommunications is gone. I don't know how they communicate, but I guess they will figure something out. It's not working out too well. And they're bad people. They're just bad people. When you look at October 7th and beyond October 7th, look at all the killing that they've done over the years, for 47 years. And this had to be done. They were very close to a nuclear weapon. They would have had one if we didn't do our B-2 hit, Midnight Hammer. They would have had it 8 months ago. They would have had a nuclear weapon, and, you know, they're crazy, and they would have used it. So we did the world a favor. And they said, well, how are you doing on a scale of 0 to 10? How are you doing with the attack? And I said, about a 15, I would say, with 10 being the best. But it's something that had to be done, and we're doing it well. And I want to thank everybody involved. I'll be going right after this. I'll be leaving for Dover, very sad situation, to greet the families of the heroes coming home from Iran, coming home in a different manner than they thought they'd be coming home. But they're great heroes in our country, and we're going to keep it that way. There's always, when it comes to war, there's always that. But we're going to keep it to a minimum, I think, Pete, and going to be something, a service that we're really providing, not for the Middle East, but for the world. These were sick people, very sick people. This morning, I'm honored to welcome distinguished heads of state from across the Western Hemisphere for the first Shield of the Americas Summit. And it's something very, very special. Marco's been working on it very hard, so have a lot of other people, because it's a very important place for us. It's nice to be home. It's very, very important. You know, we go all over the world, 9,000 miles away, 12,000 miles away. I said, how long is this flight? Sir, this flight is 19 hours. I said, oh, that's great. I said, now I have flights that last for 2 hours. I like that better. Much better. But on this historic day, we come together to announce a brand new military coalition to eradicate the criminal cartels plaguing our region. And you have a lot of it. One of the things when we were talking backstage, you were telling me the crime, the cartels, and we're knocking the hell out of them where we can. We're going to go heavier. You saw what we were doing with the boats coming in. The boats, there's not a lot of people coming in by boats anymore. We knocked down drugs coming in by sea. Drugs coming in through water is down 96%. We're trying to find out who the other 4% are, because I think they're the bravest people in the world. Either that or they don't watch television, right? They're either very brave or they're not watching. But we're calling this military partnership the America's Counter Cartel Coalition. And that's what you need. You have cartels. They seem to grow in this region unbelievably rapidly. It has to do with drugs largely. Earlier this week here in Miami, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, who's right here. Pete, you are fantastic, doing a great job. We're proud of you. And representatives of 17 different nations formally entered this new alliance. The heart of our agreement is a commitment to using lethal military force to destroy the sinister cartels and terrorist networks once and for all. We'll get rid of them. We need your help. You have to just tell us where they are. We have amazing weaponry, as you probably noticed over the last short period of time. But I want to thank members of the coalition, most of whom are friends of mine. Few of them I just met, but most of whom are friends, many of whom I endorsed And they took that endorsement and they went on to win big. I haven't had a bad endorsement yet, right? He says, yes. He was happy. He was a couple of points down and went up like a rocket ship, right, in Argentina. But the president of Argentina is here, Javier Milei. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. President of El Salvador, another friend, Nayib Bukele. You know, he is a man who we've gotten very close to. I saw him as a young man my first time. You were young and handsome. Now you're older and handsome. You're older and handsome. But he runs a good operation. That's all I care about, right? When I first saw him, I said, he's too young. And then I saw the job he did. I said, well, I guess he's not too young, because I was young and did well. But you've been a great president, and we appreciate the relationship very much. President of Paraguay, Santiago Peña, thank you very much. Thank you very much. President of Ecuador, Danielle Noboa. Danielle, thank you. Thank you, Danielle. President of Panama, I love that canal. Jose, I think he made the greatest deal in history. He bought it for $1. One of our brilliant presidents. I can't sleep over that deal. They gave it to him for $1. Jose Raul Molino, whereas, you know, you made one of the greatest real estate deals in history. Jimmy Carter, one of our great presidents. President of Honduras, Tito Asfora. Thank you, Tito. Thank you very much. Great to see you the other day. President of Guyana, Irfan Ali. Thank you. President of Bolivia, Rodrigo Paz. Thank you very much. Great people. Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And I have to be very careful with this because, you know, your first name is very similar to a first name that we have, but fortunately it's pronounced different. It's Kamala, as opposed to Kamala. I like Kamala better in many ways. And I just want to say thank you very much, but I had to be careful with that first name. I didn't want to get it mixed up because it would ruin your reputation completely. Right? I said, is this the same pronunciation? No, sir, it's a little different. It's Cam, right? Cam, as opposed to Calm. We don't like Calm. President of Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chavez, as well as the President-elect of Costa Rica, Laura Fernandez Delgado. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the President of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader. And so many of my friends are in the Dominican, including the Sugar King, right? He is indeed the Sugar King. He got a lot of sugar. I don't know if that's good or bad, but he's got a lot of it, right? But we're grateful to be joined as well by the President-elect of Chile, Jose Cast. Congratulations. It's an endorsement. Gave you a little endorsement. I love when I give endorsements and people win. But you know what? They don't lose. You know, I don't know. I guess it would be illegal. Could you imagine if I could say they spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on a campaign? They're losing, and they beg me for an endorsement. I give them an endorsement. They win by 30 points, and I get nothing. If I could sell that, is there a way? Do we have any of our legal people here? Marco's close enough. Is there a way I could get paid for that, Marco? I'd make a lot. They spend millions of dollars. And I give it for nothing. I could, even if I put it into the Treasury of the United States, it would be pretty good, right, Marco? But Marco's saying this is not a good idea. No, but it's an honor to do it. It's an honor to have that power where I can endorse somebody, and even in foreign countries. Here it was, we had one in this week, 124-0 with endorsements, and so that's good. But now I'm doing foreign countries all of a sudden. To say, sir, would you endorse me? And it's an honor. If I like you, I only do it if I think you're good. You know, if I think you're not good, I've turned down many more than I've accepted, believe me. I want to thank Secretary of State Marco Rubio for his leadership in organizing this really important summit. He's fantastic. He's a fantastic Secretary of State. And thus far, look, we've had the most incredible year of any president, I think, I ended 8 wars. We're not going to go into it too much today, but what we've done is incredible. And we're going to be doing some incredible things together, because I look at our region, if I can call it that, as being very important. It's been abandoned by the United States for so many years. They went so far away. They went to these faraway places where they weren't even wanted. And a lot of stupid people, really stupid people. But Marco is going to go down, I think, as the best Secretary of State in history. That's my opinion. Now, I'm a little prejudiced because I like him too. But I think he's on his way. So you've done 25%. You got 75%. He's got 3 years left. So he's got 25% under your belt. So far, you're leading. You're very leading by just about a smidge over a couple of pretty great ones. We've had a couple of pretty great ones, right? But I think he's going to do that. And I think Pete's right there, too. If Pete keeps going, he's going to be something, too. At what he does. All of the nations in this room share the same priorities: security, prosperity, free commerce, and the rule of law. And you want the rule of law. Sometimes your communities don't let you have it because you got some rough communities, right? That's why together we're also forming the Shield of Americas, a new organization to advance these shared priorities in our hemisphere. And we're pleased to be joined as well by Secretaries Pete Hegseth, Scott Bessent. Scott, thank you very much, Scott. Oh, it has to be a big deal if you're here. Well, he controls the purse strings of the country. He goes on television and he just soothes everybody. He did it yesterday. The prices were going. He got on. He's a soothing person. He's actually a killer, but I don't want to say that. No, he's a soothing person. He goes on television. Right, Pete? I think nobody better. So we could use him for war every once in a while, soothe. Although we don't really want that kind of a personality for war. We want your personality for war. You're just perfect. Howard Lutnick. Thank you, Howard. Chris Wright. Kristi Noem. Along with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who you all know and you deal with. You deal very successfully. I ask Jamieson all the time, can you get more? Can you get more? He's the king of tariffs, right? But he's very gentle. We want to be very gentle with our friends, right, Jamieson? Deputy Secretary of State Chris Lando. Chris, where is Chris? I haven't seen Chris. He's fantastic. He was an incredible student. He went to the best schools, and he was #1 in his class at all times. And Marco saw that and saw the talent he's got, and she said, that's the guy I want as a deputy, and I heard you're doing a great job. Thank you very much. Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Stephen is, I don't have to tell you anything about Stephen. Everyone knows. There's nothing, Stephen, there's nothing I can say. He's fantastic, that's all I can say. And Senator Bernie Moreno, who's a credible friend of mine, and he ran a great race. He was not given much of a chance. He was running against a person who was there for a long time and was sort of considered a shoo-in, right, Bernie? And we knocked him out. We knocked him out. He's trying to make a comeback, but we took him out. And Bernie's done a great job. For decades, leaders in this region have allowed large swaths of territory in the Western Hemisphere to come under the direct control, and transnational gangs have taken over and they've run areas of your country. We're not going to let that happen. We'll help you. And bloodthirsty cartels that impose their will through murder, torture, extortion, drug trafficking, bribery, and terror. And some of you are in danger. I mean, you're actually in danger. It's hard to believe. But we're working with you to do whatever we have to do. We'll use missiles. If you want us to use a missile, they're extremely accurate. Boom, right into the living room. That's the end of that cartel person. But we'll do whatever you need if you want. A lot of countries don't want to do that. They say, oh, sure, I'd rather not have that. I'd rather not have that. I believe they can be spoken to. I don't think so. Many of them don't want, and that's okay too. You're going to do your, but if you need help, you're going to let us know, okay? Many of the cartels have developed sophisticated military operations, highly sophisticated. In some cases, they say they're more powerful than the military in the country. We can't have that. These brutal criminal organizations pose an unacceptable threat to national security, and they provide a dangerous gateway for foreign adversaries in our region. And we don't want them near our country either. We don't want them to come in. They're cancer, you know. They're cancer, and we don't want it spreading. We have a very strong border. You know, we have a border now where for 9 months, 0 people have been able to come through. It's hard to believe, actually, because we went from 25 million people coming in over the Sleepy Joe Biden, one of the worst presidents in history of the world. He was the worst president in the history of our country. We've had some pretty bad ones. Recently, we've had some pretty bad ones, but he's the worst. But he would go down as one of the worst in the world. I'm going to up his category now. It's horrible what he did. And what he didn't do was probably worse than what he did. Every leader here today is united in the conviction that we cannot and will not tolerate the lawlessness in our hemisphere any longer. The only way to defeat these enemies is by unleashing.
You've been listening to President Donald Trump speaking in Doral, Florida at the Summit of the Americas. This is a gathering of Western Hemisphere, Latin American, South American leaders in Florida. But he actually started his remarks talking about Iran. He said, we've made tremendous progress. He said the U.S. has successfully taken out 42 naval ships. Also, their telecommunication systems. He said he doesn't know how they're communicating, but he assumes they're getting around it, and called them bad people. He said he's also been asked how the effort in Iran is going so far on a scale of 1 to 10. He said it was about a 15. He then pivoted to the summit, saying that the gathering of leaders was to address the cartels and to use some of that military might that you've seen in Iran to take out those threats. He then went through the room and started naming off leaders. First among them was Javier Milei, obviously the Argentine president, who you remember as the guy who wielded the glittering chainsaw at CPAC a little while ago, big Trump supporter, and Nayib Bukele from El Salvador, also known to be openly supportive of the president.
A long list of names there, and I want to talk about who's in the room and who isn't. Creighton Harrison joins us now, executive editor for Latin America. He is based in Mexico City, and Wendy Benjaminson is with us as well. She's a senior editor who's based in our Washington, D.C. Newsroom. Creighton, let me start with you. He went through the list. You were listening. Pronunciation of varying accuracy on some of these names. But what can we take away from who's in that room with him in Florida today? And then there was an allusion, of course, to what might happen with Cuba going forward. I know this is something that you and our colleagues are monitoring closely as well, as we're kind of transfixed on what's happening in the Middle East. The president's designs on there being some leadership change on the island of Cuba as well.
Yeah, exactly. You've got, like you said, some allies, some established allies in the room, like Javier Milei and Nayib Bukele, but you've also got some sort of, I would say, like aspirational allies, including Rodrigo Paz from Bolivia, and a couple of Central American presidents who have had sort of more centrist sorts of views, but have been sort of pulled into the gravitational pull of the United States in this sort of reconfiguration of the U.S. worldview. So there are some notable absences, as you noted. The biggest being Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico and Lula from Brazil. Right, these are the two most important economies in the region, biggest countries in the region, and they are nowhere to be seen in what is supposed to be a regional effort to defend the Americas. So that's pretty important too. And yes, Cuba is sort of the elephant in the room besides Iran, I guess. But the idea that this island nation is under such intense pressure from the U.S. has all sorts of ramifications for these countries. Again, especially in Central America, where Cuba has had close relationships with many of these governments, supplies doctors. In many cases, they're the only doctors that some rural communities in Guatemala and Honduras have. So that's a pretty big deal for these countries to try to get out from under that relationship, and has some economic and health ramifications for these countries. So it's definitely a sensitive area. We'll see if they end up talking about it with the president.
Wendy, I want to bring you in because the president sounding a bit tired there. Obviously, he was up quite early. We had that tweet from him this morning saying today Iran will be hit very hard, !, and went on to talk about that conflict. He started these remarks talking about Iran, then transitioned to the point of the summit, then transitioned to name-checking people in the room, including Secretary Noem and Marco Rubio, then went off talking about how he has such a good track record endorsing leaders in other countries and that he should maybe get paid for that. No, he can't. He said, I can't do that. That would be bad, even if it went to the Treasury. There's a lot of messaging happening here. The president does have priorities. He does need to get the American people on board with what he's doing in Iran, with what he might be doing in the Western Hemisphere. How does he can he successfully do this many things at once?
Well, you make an excellent point that he's doing a lot of messaging, but it's sort of like a shotgun blast instead of, a sniper rifle, if you will. He's messaging, as you just recounted, about everything all at once. And he was in the middle of a Medal of Honor ceremony earlier this week, and he was talking about the deaths of U.S. Military members in this conflict, and then suddenly started talking about the drapes in the room. So, I'm quite sure that the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, is very eager for him to stay on a single message. And the message she had wanted him to stay on was a domestic message about how the Republican Party is working to make the U.S. economy more affordable as the primaries are underway, and then the midterm elections are right around the corner. However, he started this war, and since then he and Hegseth and Rubio have given us all various reasons all at once for why this war is happening. And it's not helping convince the American people that this is the right thing to do.
Creighton, you mentioned the degree to which Cuba is the elephant in the room weighing on a lot of these leaders as the summit gets underway in South Florida. Let me ask you about how the conflict in the Middle East is on their radar, getting their attention, the way that they're thinking about the U.S.'s engagement in that part of the world, what message that sends to them. As you say, many of these countries' leaders have been brought into the president's orbit here, have felt that pull of gravity to the Trump White House.
Yeah, well, and the other one we haven't mentioned is Venezuela, right? So you have two situations between Venezuela and Iran where the U.S. has taken more aggressive action. Of course, in Venezuela, the U.S. removed the president, Nicolas Maduro, charged him with an assortment of crimes. So everyone is sort of on notice in the region that we have a more aggressive American military that's willing to go into places. Trump sort of framed that a little differently today and talked about cooperation in terms of going after narco trafficking, and said, look, if you would like us to send a missile into your country, we will. If you don't want us to, and some countries don't, he's probably referring to Mexico there. If you don't want to, then we won't. But everyone has seen that when Trump decides it's a good idea, he is willing to send in troops and take drastic action. So that puts everyone on notice. Again, these are mostly friends in the room. There's not a situation in here where anyone is worried about the direct military intervention without cooperation. But it is sort of hanging over the environment here.
Or aspiring friends, as you mentioned. I think that's a great phrase.
Exactly.
Wendy, I want to ask you, if you are a Republican staring down a contentious midterm, even if you're not, these numbers are getting tougher for Republicans. You've now got Markwayne Mullins, who is in a pretty safe seat in Oklahoma, moving over to DHS. But there is ground to try to keep, and it is an uphill battle for a lot of Republicans. If you are trying to sell this to constituents, what part of this do you think is easier, and what part of this is harder for the MAGA base to get on board with?
Well, I certainly don't envy people who are Republican political consultants this year. It is going to be difficult to come up with a message because as gas prices rise, they can only hope that they will go down in the fall when people, really start paying attention. But if they stay elevated and prices remain elevated or go higher because of the Strait of Hormuz being, traffic being halted through there and all of that, it's going to be a very, very difficult message. The only thing that they could point out is that the U.S. has long wanted, and this is true, presidents of both parties have long wanted the the fundamentalist regime in Iran to be dismantled, and they can say that that's a good thing. But if U.S. deaths pile up and prices rise, that's going to be a very, very difficult message to sell. And right now, the Republican Party, we saw this week with the defeat of the War Powers Resolution Act, the Republican Party is still behind Trump. But let's see what happens if this drags on and is not just a short 2-week bombing campaign like it has been before.
Wendy, great to talk to you. That's Wendy Benjaminson, senior editor in our Washington bureau. We had Creighton Harrison with us as well, executive editor for Latin America, based in Mexico City. As we watched the president in Doral, Florida, there at that Shield of America's summit, giving remarks and monitoring those. He's going to prepare to make his way to Delaware on the heels of this, then back to Florida for more of that summit over the latter part of the day. Continue to monitor that for headlines. Of course, you can find them at Bloomberg.com and on the terminal on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television as well. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend on this Saturday. Tomorrow, our guests include Republican Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, and S&P Global Vice Chairman Dan Yergin on the oil market. We hope you'll join us starting at 7 o'clock Wall Street time on Sunday. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini, along with Lisa Mateo. We'll have a lot more for you here tomorrow. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, Masters in Business is up next. For our TV audience, Wall Street Week with David Weston starts right now.